The train had been moving for 3 days when Montana finally showed itself through the window. And it showed itself the way only wild, indifferent country can, without apology or ceremony. No rolling hills softening the view, no church steeples or tidy fences to suggest human beings had tamed any of it. Just sky the color of pewter pressing down onto flat, frozen land that stretched so far in every direction it made Clara feel like something small and misplaced. A button that had fallen off a coat somewhere and hadn't been noticed yet. She was 31 years old. She had dark hair she kept pinned too tightly because loose hair had always felt like a luxury she couldn't justify. Her hands were calloused from needlework. Her eyes the kind of brown that could look either warm or flat, depending on what the light was doing. She was not a beauty in the way parlor magazines talked about beauty. She had never pretended to be. What she had was steadiness, a quality she'd spent most of her adult life hoping people would eventually notice, and which most people never did. In her lap she held a wooden box the size of a bread loaf. Inside it were 47 letters tied with butcher's twine because she'd never owned ribbon worth keeping. Every letter was from a man named Gerald Pratt, merchant, of Harlan Creek, Montana Territory, population approximately 600 souls, and, according to Gerald, growing. She had started the correspondence 2 years ago through a matchmaking service her neighbor Mrs. Elspeth Carver had quietly pressed into her hands one morning, folded into the newspaper like a thing that needed hiding. Clara had been too proud to write it first. Then the winter had gotten long, and the seamstress work had gotten thin, and her landlord had raised the rent, and pride had started to feel like one of those things poor people clung to when they'd already lost everything else practical. So she'd written. Gerald Pratt had written back within 2 weeks. His letters were steady and sensible. He told her about his dry goods store, his modest house with the south-facing porch, his 2 mules, and his account at the Harlan Creek Bank. He didn't write prettily. His sentences were plain and slightly formal, the handwriting of a man who'd learned letters for commerce rather than pleasure. But he'd asked her real questions, what she liked to read, whether she preferred mornings or evenings, how she felt about hard winters. Nobody had asked Clara those kinds of questions in years. By the 6th letter, she'd told him about her voice. She had done it plainly, the way she tried to do everything plainly. I should tell you before we go further that I have a condition affecting my speech. When I was 12, I had a severe inflammation of the throat that damaged something. The doctors never gave it a proper name. My voice comes out rough and quiet. People often have to lean close to hear me. I understand if this changes things for you. She had waited 3 weeks for his answer, then his letter had come. Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your honesty, and I see no reason why such a thing should affect our arrangement. A quiet woman is often a practical advantage. I look forward to your arrival in March. She had read that letter probably 60 times in the months that followed. She had read it on the train. She read it again now, holding the paper near the smudged window as the Montana landscape rolled by outside, reading it the way a person reads something they've memorized, but still need the physical proof of. A quiet woman is often a practical advantage. It was not exactly poetry, but it had felt like enough. The train pulled into Harlan Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon. The station was a single wooden platform with a hand-painted sign and a water tower that leaned. There were maybe 20 people on the platform, some waiting for cargo, some meeting passengers. A few just standing in the way people stand in small towns when arrival of the weekly train is the most significant event on any given Tuesday. Clara stepped down from the car with her trunk, which she dragged herself because the porter had moved on to someone else. She wore her blue wool dress, her best, made with her own hands, fitted correctly at the shoulder, and let out a 1/4 inch at the waist because she'd made it 3 years ago and things had shifted. Her coat was charcoal gray. She had worn her good boots. She had tried. She looked for Gerald Pratt. She had a daguerreotype of him in the box with the letters. A square-jawed man, mid-40s, with a heavy mustache and the flat expression of someone who doesn't trust photographs. She scanned the platform, and then she found him, standing apart from the others, his hat in his hands, watching the passengers disembark with the expression of a man waiting to receive a crate of goods he'd ordered. She walked toward him. She raised her hand slightly. He saw her. For a moment, nothing happened. He looked at her the way you look at something when you're calculating whether it matches the description. "Mr. Pratt," she said. That was all she said. Just his name. 2 words. But the voice that came out was the voice she always had. Rough at the edges, slightly hoarse, quieter than ordinary. The kind of voice that made people look up suddenly like they'd heard something unexpected. Gerald Pratt's expression shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was worse than dramatic. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pulling back of the shoulders. The expression of a man recalculating. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's good to finally—" "I received your letter," he said, cutting her off. He wasn't looking at her directly anymore. He was looking slightly past her, at the train, at the platform, at the several people who were close enough to hear. "About your voice." "Yes," she said. "I wanted to be honest with you. I thought—" "The letter didn't convey the extent of it," he said. Clara stopped talking. She stood very still. "You sound," he said, and then he paused, and in that pause she heard 22 months of correspondence and a 2,000-mile journey. "You sound like something is wrong with you." Someone nearby had gone quiet. Clara didn't look. She kept her eyes on Gerald Pratt's face. "There is something wrong with me," she said. "I told you that." "There is a difference," he said, and now his voice had gone flat and businesslike, between a woman with a quiet voice and a woman who sounds like she is ill. People will think you are ill. Or worse, they will think— He stopped again. He turned his hat in his hands. "I run a business in this town. I have a reputation. The kind of arrangement I was proposing requires a partner who presents suitably." "Suitably," Clara repeated. "I'm sorry," he said. He did not sound sorry. He sounded like a man concluding a transaction that had not gone as expected. "I don't think this is going to work." He put his hat back on his head, nodded once, and walked off the platform. Clara stood there with her trunk in the mud, and her letterbox in her hands, and the several strangers near enough to have heard every word. And she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in public only gave people something to look at, and she was not going to give these people that. She picked up the handle of her trunk and dragged it to the far end of the platform and sat down on it. For a while, she simply breathed. She had $14.60. She had a return ticket she could use if she left on the next train heading east, which came through on Thursdays. Today was Tuesday. She had 2 days to decide. She looked at the town of Harlan Creek, the main street visible from where she sat, a row of wood-fronted buildings, a livery, a hotel with a sign she couldn't read from this distance, a few figures moving along the muddy street. The wind was thin and cold and carried the smell of animals and wood smoke. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up her trunk and walked into town. The hotel was called the Milligan House, which made it sound more distinguished than it was. The front room smelled of tobacco and old cooking and the particular damp that comes from too many people being too close together through a long winter. The woman at the desk had red hands and a brisk, impersonal manner. "One night?" she said. "I'll need to know your weekly rate," Clara said. The woman looked at her the way people always looked at Clara when they first heard her voice. That quick, startled glance. The reassessment. "You looking for work?" "I'm a seamstress." The woman studied her for a moment. Her name, Clara would learn later, was Dolores Milligan, and she had run this hotel for 11 years since her husband died. And she was not a soft woman, but she was a fair one. She gave Clara the weekly rate, which was 60 cents, and told her the dining room served breakfast and supper included in the price. "Is there work for a seamstress in this town?" Clara asked. "There's Mrs. Lund on Creekside who does alterations, but she can't keep up with the spring orders, and she'd probably take on someone part-time. There's the Halverson Ranch that's been looking for someone to repair sail canvas and work clothes. And there's the theater. Harlan Creek's got a small theater. Mr. Burley runs it. He's always wanting costume work." Dolores Milligan paused. "Why are you staying? I heard about what Pratt did on the platform." Clara set her coin on the desk. "1 week, please." Dolores looked at her for another moment, then scooped the coin into her apron pocket. "Room 6, she said. "End of the hall. The stovepipe works, but it takes some coaxing." But Clara was coaxing the stovepipe when someone knocked at her door. She opened it to find a girl of about 16, thin-armed with a serious face, holding a supper tray that she apparently was not going to bring in without being asked. "Mrs. Milligan said to bring this up," the girl said. She was looking at Clara with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of someone young enough to not yet pretend they aren't looking. "Are you the woman who came to marry Mr. Pratt?" "I was," Clara said. "And he sent you away because of your voice?" "That's right." "That's a terrible thing to do," the girl said, with the absolute certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to hedge moral judgment. "He's a terrible man." "I don't know him well enough to say that," Clara said. She stepped back from the door. "Do you want to come in?" The girl came in and set the tray on the small table near the window. On it was a bowl of beef stew, a square of cornbread, and a cup of tea that was already cooling. "My name's Petra," the girl said. "I work for Mrs. Milligan. My family has a farm 2 miles east." "Clara Whitmore." "What will you do now?" "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. She sat down and looked at the stew. She realized she was very hungry. "I'll figure it out." Petra watched her eat for a moment in the unself-conscious way that teenagers watch things. "Mrs. Milligan says you're a seamstress." "Yes." "Mr. Pratt's store is the only place in town that sells ready-made dresses, and they're ugly. Mrs. Halverson says they look like feed sacks with aspirations." Petra said this with the pleasure of someone repeating a good line they'd been holding on to. People would pay for proper seamstress work if there was someone to do it. Clara looked up at her. "Just saying," Petra said. The next morning, Clara walked every street in Harlan Creek. It was Wednesday. The sky was white with cloud cover, the temperature just above freezing, the mud on the main street a constant treacherous situation that all the townspeople navigated with the practiced indifference of people who had stopped expecting different. She wore her practical boots and she walked slowly, taking inventory. The town was larger than she'd expected from the station. 2 parallel streets running north-south, 4 cross streets, a creek that gave the place its name running along the eastern edge where a small mill sat. There were 2 saloons, a church she noted only as a landmark, a school building with its shutters needing paint, the hotel, a doctor's office with a shingle, a barber shop, Gerald Pratt's dry goods store. She looked at it when she passed, but did not slow down. And at the north end of the main street, a building with a marquee board that said, Harlan Creek Theater / Friday and Saturday evenings / this spring, the Mountain Players. She went inside. The theater was small, 40 seats, a proper stage, curtains the color of old blood that had seen better decades. A man was up a ladder doing something to a rigging rope when she walked in. He was perhaps 60, with a white beard and the theatrical habit of speaking as though there was always an audience somewhere. "We're closed," he said, without looking down. "I'm looking for Mr. Burley." "You've found him. What do you want?" "I'm a seamstress. I heard you need costume work." He looked down then. He took her in the same way everyone in this town took her in. The assessment, the categorizing. But there was something different in his face, a professional appraisal rather than a social one. His eyes went to her hands. "You do it for a living or as a hobby?" "For a living, 12 years in Philadelphia." "What kind of work?" "Alterations, repairs, some original construction. I can work with wool, cotton, silk." She hesitated. "I'm less comfortable with heavy leather, but I can manage." He came down the ladder with the practiced ease of a man who'd been climbing ladders since before she was born. He was shorter than she'd expected from up top, stocky, with a limp on his left side. "Let me hear you," he said. She stopped. "Hear me? You've got that voice," he said. It was matter of fact, not unkind. "I heard about what happened at the station yesterday. In a small town, it takes about 45 minutes for things to get around. I want to make sure I can hear you when I'm at the back of the house." Clara looked at him. Then she said clearly and directly, "I can make myself heard when I need to. I have had 12 years of practice talking to clients who weren't listening." Burley looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled. "Come back tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll have the costume inventory pulled out and you can tell me what you can do with it." She thanked him, low and rough, and walked back out into the cold. She also found Mrs. Lund on Creekside. Mrs. Lund was a Norwegian woman in her 60s with white hair and enormous competence, and absolutely no patience for conversation that wasn't about sewing. She had 3 dresses half finished, 2 suits needing alteration, and what she called a mountain of work for the Halverson Ranch, 40-odd garments needing repair before spring planting. "Can you do flat-felled seams?" Mrs. Lund asked. "Yes." "Invisible hem on wool?" Yes. What about buttonholes by hand? Because a machine buttonhole on good wool is an insult. I agree, Clara said. Mrs. Lund looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding something. I can pay you piece rate. 12 cents per garment for simple alterations, 20 for complex, 35 for the suits. It wasn't a generous offer. It was also an offer, which was more than Clara had walked in with. I'll start with the Halverson work, Clara said. I can bring you the first 10 pieces by Friday. Mrs. Lund nodded once and showed her out. The problems started slowly, which was almost worse than if they had started fast. She had been in Harlan Creek for 6 days when she first became aware of Gerald Pratt watching her. Not in any overt way. She would catch him at the window of his store as she passed, or notice him in conversation with men who looked her way. She dismissed it. She was a stranger in a small town, and strange things happened in small towns. But then Petra told her quietly, as she was bringing Clara's breakfast tray, that Mr. Pratt had told someone at the barber shop that the seamstress from Philadelphia had come west under a pretense, presenting herself as suitable for marriage when she clearly had some kind of affliction, and that people in town ought to know they were dealing with a woman who was not entirely as she represented herself. Clara sat with this information for a moment. He told people I was sick? She said. Or something like it, Petra said unhappily. He said your voice was a sign of a deeper condition. He didn't say what condition. He doesn't know what condition, Clara said, because there isn't one. I know that, Petra said, but he said it at the barber shop, and now Hector Marsh said it at the feed store, and it's just... She made a helpless gesture. That's how it goes here. Clara finished her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Thank you for telling me, she said. She went to work. Working. The thing about working, about having skilled, necessary work to do, was that it cut through a great deal of noise. By her second week in Harlan Creek, Clara had finished the Halverson repairs, delivered them on time, and had 4 new clients come to Mrs. Lund's door asking specifically for the new woman who could do invisible hems on wool. Word traveled in the barber shop, apparently, but it also traveled among the women who were tired of paying Philadelphia prices for workmanship that wasn't worth it. At the theater, Burley had given her access to 3 costumes that were, as she put it to herself privately, crimes. She had spent a Tuesday evening dismantling a doublet that had been resized 4 times by people who didn't know what they were doing and had remade it from scratch in a day and a half. When Burley had put it on his lead actor and the man actually fit the thing for the first time in 3 productions, Burley had stood in the middle of the stage and said, in his theatrical way, Miss Whitmore, you have my full and professional gratitude. I'll put it on your bill, Clara had said, and Burley had laughed, surprised. She was building something. It was fragile and small, and she knew it, but it was there. And then she met Gerald Pratt face to face for the second time. It was at the general store. Not his store, but Hannigan's at the south end of the street where she'd gone to buy thread. She came around the corner of the notions aisle, and there he was, picking up tobacco, and for a moment neither of them moved. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Pratt, she said. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her on the platform, that calculating reassessment, except now there was something else in it, something that looked almost like irritation. The irritation, she understood, of a man who had done something dismissive and expected it to be final, only to have the thing he'd dismissed continue to exist and require being looked at. I hope you've made arrangements to return east, he said. His voice was measured, even. He was speaking pleasantly, the way he probably spoke to customers he intended to overcharge. I've made arrangements to stay, Clara said. A small pause. Is that wise? I think so, yes. This is a hard town, he said. It requires... He seemed to choose his words, a certain kind of person, to thrive here. I know, Clara said. I'm finding that out. She picked up her thread, the right weight, 3 spools, which she had checked before he appeared, and walked to the front counter to pay. She heard him standing in the aisle behind her for a moment before his boots moved away toward the door. Her hands were steady when she counted out her coins. She made sure of that. But by the end of her 3rd week, Clara had found a better arrangement than the hotel. A woman named Florence Acker, whose husband had gone east for some kind of family matter and left her with a large house she couldn't quite manage alone, offered her a room in exchange for help with alterations and the household mending. It was a practical arrangement for both of them, and it got Clara out of the Milligan house, which she'd come to feel too visible in. Florence Acker was 43, sharp-tongued, and lonely in the particular way of women whose husbands were present in their lives, just enough to prevent them from building alternative systems of support. She had opinions about everything and mostly kept them to herself, which Clara recognized as its own kind of damage. They got along well. They ate supper together most evenings and talked about practical things: the garden, the weather, what the Halverson boy had done to his fence. And occasionally, when the evening got quiet enough, Florence would say something real. "Gerald Pratt," Florence said one night, over mending, "is the kind of man who has never once in his life been told he was wrong about anything by someone he couldn't dismiss." "That covers a lot of people," Clara said. "It does," Florence agreed, "but in Gerald's case, it's particularly fixed. He needs to be the authority on everything within his view. When he's wrong, he doesn't change his mind. He changes the story." She looked up from her work. "He's changing the story about you." "I know," Clara said. "He's telling people you misrepresented yourself, that there are other problems, not just your voice. He's been vague about what, which is clever of him, because vagueness is harder to disprove than a specific lie." Clara kept her needle moving. In, out, even tension. "What do you think I should do?" Florence was quiet for a moment. "I think the only answer to a vague lie is visible evidence, but that takes time, and in the meantime, you have to get used to being looked at sideways." "I've been looked at sideways most of my life," Clara said. Florence looked at her. "Is that right?" "People hear the voice and they make a decision. It's quick. I've learned not to spend energy arguing with the decision, just to do the work and let that be the argument." Florence put her mending down. She looked at Clara for a long moment. "Gerald Pratt," she said finally, "has never once in his life encountered a woman who simply didn't need him to be satisfied with her." Clara didn't say anything to that. She kept sewing, but something about the sentence settled in her somewhere, like a nail finding solid wood. It was the following week that she first saw Cole Mercer. She was coming back from the Halverson Ranch, which was a 2-mile walk east along the creek road, carrying a bundle of completed repairs in a canvas bag. The light was going late afternoon gold, the kind of light that makes even a muddy frontier road look like it was painted by someone who cared, and she was tired in the good, clean way that came from having done a full day's work. He came up the road from the opposite direction on a bay horse that moved with the careful step of an animal picking its way on uncertain ground. He was maybe 35, broad-shouldered, dark-haired under his hat, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days outside regardless of what the weather was doing. He rode well, not showily, just well, with the ease of someone for whom a horse is not a performance but a tool. They were going to pass each other, that was all. Two people on a road. But as he came level with her, a dog that had been following her, a skinny, underfed thing she'd been feeding scraps to for the past week, darted under the horse's legs. The horse shied. Not badly, not dangerously, but it startled, and Clara grabbed the dog without thinking, pulling it clear, and the two of them, the horse and the dog and Clara, all had a moment of confused rearrangement. The man got the horse steady. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. She said, "Sorry, the dog is mine. Conditionally, I think." He didn't answer. He was looking at her face, not in the way she was used to being looked at, that moment of assessment, the decision, but in a way she couldn't quite read. He was watching her mouth. She started to say something else, some further apology, and then she understood. He tipped his hat to her, very deliberately. Then he pointed at the dog, then at her, then made a small gesture with his hand, a sort of, "He's with you?" "Yes," she said. "He follows me. I haven't decided if that's official yet." He nodded, still watching her face. Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but close. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode on. Clara stood on the road for a moment with the skinny dog under her arm. Later, when she'd asked Petra who that was, Petra had said, "Oh, that's Cole Mercer. He's got the ranch out on the north pasture. He's deaf. Has been since he was a boy, I think." Petra had paused. "He's pretty much just to himself. People here don't know what to do with him, mostly. Clara had looked down at the dog, who had now decided that her feet were the best place to be. People don't know what to do with a lot of things, she'd said. She hadn't thought too much more about it. She had work to do. She had a position to build in a town that was still deciding what to do with her. She had Gerald Pratt conducting a quiet, steady campaign against her reputation, and she had $14 left from her original $14.60 because she'd spent 60 cents on thread. And she had a skinny dog she was apparently keeping and a room in Florence Acker's house and a pile of work beside her bed that was getting smaller one piece at a time. She had the frontier. She had not chosen it, not really, but it was hers now, the way that things you refuse to leave eventually become yours, whether you intended it or not. She went back to work. The season was turning. The mud was beginning to harden. Something in the air carried the tentative, unearned promise of spring, the kind of thing the Montana sky offered without any guarantee it meant it. Clara had learned not to count on promises. What she counted on was thread and needle and the next piece in the pile, and the particular satisfaction of a flat-felled seam run perfectly true. That was what she had. For now, it was enough. Spring came to Harlan Creek the way it always did in that part of Montana, grudgingly, in fits and starts, with cold snaps arriving after warm days like a landlord showing up after you'd already rearranged the furniture. The mud on the main street went from frozen solid to treacherous slick to something almost manageable, and the townspeople emerged from their winter habits with the slightly dazed quality of people who had spent 4 months mostly indoors and were now remembering that the world had more dimensions than they'd been using. Clara had been in Harlan Creek for 5 weeks. She had 6 regular clients now, women who came to Florence Acker's front room on appointment, which was a word Clara used deliberately because it made the arrangement sound more established than it was. She had continued work with Mrs. Lund, and Burley at the theater had referred her to 2 other productions coming through town in April that needed costume repair. The Halverson Ranch had sent word asking if she could take on a standing contract for the season's workwear. 22 ranch hands worth of gear that needed maintenance through spring and summer. She had said yes to all of it. She went to bed tired every night and woke up before light every morning, and the money was still thin, but it was moving in the right direction, which was a direction she understood. What she had not quite accounted for was the weight of doing all of it alone. Not the work. The work was fine. The work was, in many ways, the easiest part of being here. It was the other hours, the hours around the work, where the loneliness had a particular quality she hadn't expected. She had been lonely in Philadelphia too, but that had been the anonymous loneliness of a city, where no one noticed you specifically. Here in Harlan Creek, people noticed her. They just mostly noticed her in the way Gerald Pratt had arranged for them to notice her, as a question mark. Something slightly off. A woman with a strange voice and an unclear situation who had arrived under contested circumstances and stayed for reasons that required explaining. Florence was good company. Petra brought breakfast with conversation attached. Burley treated her like a professional, which was its own kind of warmth. But those were the relationships of work and proximity, and there was a difference. Clara knew this, had always known this, between people who tolerated you comfortably and people who actually saw you. She was thinking about none of this, or trying not to, on the Thursday afternoon when the dog, she had named him Button, because of what she'd thought the first time she'd seen Montana through the train window, bolted off the creek road and into the brush after something he clearly had no ability to catch. Button, she said. Her voice didn't carry the way she sometimes needed it to, and he was already deep in the scrub. She put her canvas work bag down on the road and went after him with the resigned energy of someone who has learned that small, stupid problems demand to be dealt with before they become larger ones. She found him, eventually, after 20 minutes of following the sound of crashing through undergrowth, stuck in a length of old fence wire that had come loose from its post and was lying half buried in the new spring grass. He had one back leg caught in a twist of it and had made things worse by spinning, the way dogs do. Convinced that the answer to any problem is faster movement, she knelt down and started working the wire loose, talking to him in the low, continuous way she'd developed because he responded to the sound of her voice even when he couldn't hear the words clearly. Hold still, just hold still. I know it's uncomfortable. Hold. You need a hand with that. She looked up. Cole Mercer was standing maybe 6 feet away, hat in hand, watching her hands on the wire with an expression of practical assessment. He had clearly come up the path from the direction of the north pasture, which she knew now was the road to his ranch. He was not on horseback this time, just on foot, with a pair of wire cutters on his belt that she had not had and desperately needed. She stared at him. He pointed at the wire cutters, then at Button, then raised his eyebrows. A question. "Yes," she said, which she realized immediately was useless, and then held up one hand in a please wait gesture and used the other to hold Button still. Cole Mercer came forward and crouched down beside her. He was close enough that she could see his hands clearly. Big hands, work roughened, with a long scar along the right index finger that had healed thick. He assessed the wire the way she'd seen skilled people assess problems. Not immediately, but carefully, taking a moment before acting. Then he used the cutters at exactly the right point, and Button's leg came free. Button immediately licked Cole Mercer's face with the total sincerity of an animal who has no complicated feelings about strangers. Something happened in Cole Mercer's expression. A crack in it, brief and unguarded. Something close to amusement. He put one hand on Button's flank, checking the leg with careful fingers. No cuts, just friction marks that would be sore for a day or two. Clara was watching his face. He looked up and found her watching him. Neither of them moved for a second. She reached into the pocket of her coat and took out the small notebook she had started carrying 2 weeks ago, when she had begun to understand that communication with Cole Mercer might become a recurring practical necessity, and she should stop relying on gestures that only half worked. She wrote, "Thank you. His leg? Is it all right?" She turned the notebook so he could read it. He read it, nodded once, and then held out his hand for the pencil. She gave it to him. He wrote, in a clear, even hand that surprised her. She didn't know why it surprised her, but it did. "No damage. He'll be sore. Keep him off the leg tonight if you can." She read it. She looked up at him. She took the notebook back and wrote, "I'll try." He doesn't follow instructions well. He read it, and that crack in his expression happened again, less brief this time. He wrote, "Neither does most of anything worth keeping." Clara looked at that sentence for a moment. Then she wrote back, "That seems like a philosophy." He read it. He looked at her, really looked at her, the kind of look that meant something different from all the looks she'd been getting in this town. Not an assessment of what was wrong with her, something else, something more like recognition. He wrote, "Maybe. Are you walking back to town?" "Yes. I'll walk the same road a while, if that's all right." She considered this. Then she wrote, "It's a public road." He read it. This time the expression was definitely amusement, and she felt something ease slightly in her chest, the way things ease when you've been holding yourself carefully for a long time, and something makes you forget to keep doing it. They walked back toward town together, with Button limping cheerfully between them, and the afternoon light going long and gold across the pasture grass. She learned things slowly, the way you learn things about a person who communicates in a different key than you do. Not in a rush of words, but in pieces, each one deliberate. Cole Mercer was 37. He had gone deaf at 14 from a fever that had taken his older brother and left Cole with permanent silence, and a family that had not, he later gathered, known what to do with a deaf son in a world that required constant verbal navigation. He had left home at 17, done a variety of things in a variety of places, and had ended up in Montana 12 years ago working for a rancher named Aldous Webb, who had hired him not despite his deafness but because of his skill with horses, which was self-evident regardless of whether you could explain it in words. When Aldous Webb died, Cole had inherited a portion of the land in the will, a fact that had apparently surprised the rest of Harlan Creek considerably, since most of them had not thought to inquire what Cole Mercer actually owned or knew or was capable of. He ran 50 head of cattle now, with 2 hired hands who had worked with him long enough to communicate efficiently, and his operation was by most practical measures more successful than half the ranches in the county. Clara learned these facts in pieces over 3 weeks, through the exchange of the notebook, which had become their primary instrument and which she had started keeping dry wrapped in a cloth because Montana spring meant unexpected rain. It was an inefficient system. It was also, she found, a surprisingly honest one. When you had to write a thing down, you thought about whether you actually wanted to say it before you said it. Whole categories of filler, the "oh wells" and "you knows" and "as I was sayings" that padded most conversation, fell away. What was left was what actually needed saying. She told him about Philadelphia, about the seamstress work, about the 12 years of building a business in a place that had never quite felt like home. She wrote, "I came here thinking a new place might be a new start. I didn't think clearly about what a new place meant in practice." He read that and wrote back, "Most people don't." What did it mean in practice? That the problems that followed me from Philadelphia were the same ones, just with different weather. He considered that for a moment. He had a habit of pausing before responding that she'd come to read as genuine thought rather than hesitation, and then wrote, "What problems?" "People hear my voice and decide I'm broken before I've had a chance to be anything else." He looked up from the notebook. There was something in his face, not pity, which she would have resented, but a kind of flat recognition. The expression of someone who has had the same conversation with themselves so many times it has become background noise. He wrote, "I know something about that. I imagine you do. The difference is," he paused, held the pencil, thinking, "I stopped expecting them to change their mind. I just stopped needing them to." She looked at that sentence for a long time. "How do you do that?" she wrote. "Stop needing it." He thought about it honestly. She could see him thinking. Then he wrote, "You find the things that are true regardless of what anyone thinks. The cattle are healthy or they're not. The fence holds or it doesn't. The work is good or it isn't. You build your life on the things that are true, and you stop letting the other things have a foundation." Clara sat with that for a moment. They were at the Creek Road, her usual point of turning back toward town. Button was asleep in the grass, leg apparently forgotten. "That sounds easier to do when you're not surrounded by the people who are deciding things about you," she wrote. "You're right," he wrote back. "It's easier out here. But you chose to stay in town." "I did." "Then you must have had a reason that outweighed the difficulty." She thought about it. She wrote, "I suppose I decided that leaving would give those people a power over my life that they hadn't earned." He read it. He nodded, very slowly, in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of saying something was true. Then he wrote, "That's exactly the right answer." She knew people were noticing them together on the road. She wasn't naive about it. Harlan Creek was 600 people and a finite number of roads, and 2 people who walked the same 2 miles 3 times a week were going to be observed. She had watched the watching begin, the way people's eyes tracked them when they passed, the way conversations shifted in pitch at the feed store when she came in after having been seen on the Creek Road. Petra reported things, as Petra did, with a combination of teenage outrage and helpless accuracy. Mrs. Halverson said she thinks it's, and I'm using her word, peculiar, Petra said one morning, setting down the breakfast tray. 2 people who both have difficulties spending time together. Difficulties, Clara repeated. Her word. What kind of difficulties does she think I have exactly? Petra made an uncomfortable face. I think she means your voice and some of the other things Mr. Pratt has said. And what difficulties does she think Mr. Mercer has? Being deaf, I suppose. She said she couldn't imagine how you even... Petra stopped. How we even talk to each other. Yes. The same way anyone talks to anyone, Clara said. We say things, and the other person receives them. She picked up her tea. The method is less important than the content. Petra looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, a kind of admiring bewilderment, like watching someone do something that looked simple but clearly wasn't. I think that's really sensible, she said. Mrs. Halverson won't think so, Clara said. No, Petra agreed. She won't. Gerald Pratt had a friend. This was how Clara had come to think of him. Not as an enemy, because that word gave him more weight than she wanted to assign, but as a man who had made a decision about her and now needed that decision to be confirmed by the world around him. His friend, in this particular enterprise, was a man named Walter Goss. Walter Goss was the county's Justice of the Peace, a title that in a small frontier town meant he had administrative authority over a wide, loosely defined range of local affairs. He was Pratt's age, heavy-set, with the deliberate manner of a man who had learned to move slowly because slow movement looked like authority. He had a desk in a room off the courthouse, a small building that also functioned as the meeting hall, and occasionally the schoolroom overflow. And from that desk he seemed to have a great deal of influence over what was considered appropriate in Harlan Creek. Clara had not interacted with him directly. She'd seen him at the feed store, at the hotel dining room once, at the edge of a conversation with Pratt outside the dry goods store. She had registered him the way you register any potential obstacle. Note the location, note the habits, do not engage before necessary. It was Florence Acker who told her about the meeting. Goss is calling a town meeting, Florence said at supper, with the controlled, careful voice of someone delivering news they know is going to land badly. At the courthouse, Wednesday evening. About what? Florence hesitated. He's calling it a community welfare discussion. He's been talking with Pratt for the past 2 weeks about, he calls it, the situation of vulnerable individuals in the community. Clara set down her fork. Meaning, Florence said, you and Cole Mercer. Among others, I imagine, but you two most specifically. The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of a house where 2 women are both thinking hard, and neither of them wants to be the first to say the obvious thing. What exactly are they proposing? Clara asked. Goss has been talking about a placement arrangement, some kind of supervised situation for, he keeps using the phrase, those who cannot adequately represent their own interests. Florence's mouth was thin with anger she was holding carefully. He means people with physical conditions. He thinks I'm incapable, Clara said. Yes. And Cole Mercer? Yes. Because I have a damaged voice and Cole is deaf. Pratt has been building the case for weeks, Florence said. He told Goss that your arrival here was itself evidence of poor judgment, that you came across the country based on correspondence to marry a man who then determined you were unsuitable. He's framed it as though you were somehow deceived into coming here, rather than the truth, which is that he rejected me publicly and I decided to stay regardless, Clara said. Yes. Florence looked at her directly. Clara, this meeting, if Goss gets enough of the town behind the idea, he can't force me anywhere, Clara said. He has administrative authority, Florence said. I don't know how far that extends. I genuinely don't know. And Cole Mercer, she stopped. What about him? He owns land. If Goss can establish him as legally, if there's a finding that he's incapable of managing his own affairs. Florence didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Set. The next morning, Clara walked the creek road. She didn't know if Cole would be there. They had no fixed arrangement. The walks had developed out of coincidence and then become habitual, but there was nothing said between them about regularity. She walked the road anyway. He was there, coming the other direction, the way he often was. He saw her face before she'd said anything, and she saw him read it. He was good at that, at reading faces, the kind of attentive reading that people who depend on visual information develop without thinking about it. He slowed. She took out the notebook. She wrote everything she knew, quickly and completely, not managing it or shaping it. The meeting, Goss, Pratt, the phrase vulnerable individuals, the phrase cannot adequately represent their own interests, the possibility of a placement arrangement. She handed him the notebook and watched him read. His face didn't show much while he read. She had noticed this about him, the discipline of a face that had learned not to perform reactions because he couldn't hear the room reacting with him, and matching expressions was a skill that required audio cues he didn't have. But when he finished reading, there was something in his eyes that was not nothing, something cold and flat and very old, like a feeling he had put down a long time ago and just found on the ground again. He held the pencil for a long moment. Then he wrote, How much of the town does Goss need? I don't know. Florence doesn't know. Who will speak against it, she thought. Florence. Burley, possibly. Mrs. Lund, I think, Petra's family. She paused, then added, I don't know how many others. He read the list. He wrote, They'll need someone to say it clearly in the room, not just vote against it. Say it clearly. Where it comes from, what it's actually for. She looked at that and felt the particular weight of what he meant. That would mean speaking publicly, she wrote. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Not asking her to do it, not pressuring, just saying the true thing the way he always said the true things. Plainly, without decoration, letting it be what it was. She took the notebook back and wrote, I haven't spoken publicly. Not in front of a crowd. My voice doesn't... People would have to be very quiet to hear me. And they wouldn't be quiet. He read it. He wrote, No, they probably wouldn't. She looked at that. She looked at him. You could write what you wanted to say and have someone else read it, he wrote. That feels like hiding. Yes, he wrote, it does. She looked at the creek. The water was running fast now with snowmelt, brown and cold and purposeful. She had been in Harlan Creek for 8 weeks. She had built something small and real here, something she hadn't had when she arrived. She thought about what it would mean to lose it, not to leave on her own terms, which was one thing, but to be assessed and found lacking and placed somewhere she hadn't chosen, which was a different thing entirely. She thought about Gerald Pratt at the platform, turning his back. She thought about all the other moments, the feed store, the barber shop, the sideways looks. She thought about what Florence had said. A man who has never been told he was wrong by someone he couldn't dismiss. She wrote, I'll speak. I don't know how it will go. I may have to ask people to lean in to hear me. Cole read it. Something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, closer to a quiet kind of certainty. He wrote, I'll be there. You won't be able to hear what's said. No, he wrote back, but I'll be there. She looked at him. That matters, she wrote. Yes, he wrote simply. That's why. The days between finding out about the meeting and the meeting itself had a stretched quality to them, time feeling both too fast and too slow. She worked. She always worked. There was the Halverson contract and a new client, a Mrs. Nora Dean whose husband was the town doctor and who had been quietly referred by Florence, and who turned out to be the kind of woman who had strong aesthetic opinions about everything, and was therefore both a difficult client and an interesting one. Dr. Dean himself came to the door one evening when Clara was finishing a fitting with his wife. He was a small, precise man in his early 50s, with the manner of someone who had spent many years deciding things quickly and had to resist the habit in social situations. He looked at Clara with professional assessment, not unkind, just practiced. My wife tells me you've met Cole Mercer, he said. I have, Clara said. He's a good man, the doctor said, with the emphasis of someone who has thought about this and decided to say it directly, rather than let it stay implied. I want you to know that my opinion of this meeting Goss is calling is precisely what you'd expect. Clara looked at him. I've been practicing medicine in this town for 9 years, he said. I have never once found evidence that either you or Cole Mercer required anyone else to manage your affairs. I intend to say so on Wednesday evening, if given the opportunity. He paused. I wanted you to know. There was something so plain and direct about it that Clara felt the back of her throat tighten unexpectedly. She kept her expression steady. Thank you, Dr. Dean, she said. He nodded once, briskly, and retreated back down the hall in the way of a man who has said what needed saying and doesn't require a ceremony around it. She saw Cole twice more before the meeting. The first time on the creek road, he was carrying a rolled length of canvas that had split along a seam, and they ended up sitting on the bank of the creek while she repaired it with the supplies she always kept in her bag, both of them working in the comfortable, not silence, of two people who don't need to fill every moment with words. He had brought her 3 eggs from his hens, wrapped in a cloth. She had not asked for them. He had brought them because he'd noticed once that she always ate her breakfast eggs at Florence's house and had said they were the best part of the morning. She wrote, You didn't have to. He wrote, I know, that was all. They sat on the bank for a while longer, and then she walked back to town, and he went back toward the ranch, and the creek kept running between them and past them and on without caring about any of it. The second time was the day before the meeting. He met her on the road and handed her the notebook, which she had left with him so he could write things down and bring them to her. A system they'd developed because some thoughts were too long for the roadside. He had written, I spoke to 2 men at the North Ranch today, Hector Farron and Jim Alcott. Both of them are coming to the meeting. Farron buys cattle from me. He told me he'd never found me difficult to do business with, and that he thought Goss's proposal was a land grab and a charitable coat. Clara read that last phrase twice. A land grab and a charitable coat. She looked up at him. He's right, isn't he, she wrote. Cole looked at the creek. He wrote, My land is the second most productive north of the ridge. Pratt's been trying to buy it for 2 years, and I've said no every time. If Goss can establish legal grounds to manage my affairs, he can force the sale, she wrote, or something close enough. She sat with that. The whole shape of it settling into place. The platform rejection, the whisper campaign, the welfare meeting, the talk of placement. Not cruelty exactly. Something worse. Strategy. They planned this, she wrote. I don't know if they planned it from the beginning, Cole wrote back, but it's become a plan. Does anyone else know about the land? Farron knows. He's willing to say it. She looked at the water for a long time. Then we have something, she wrote. He read it. He looked at her. We have something, he wrote back. The pronoun sat there on the page between them, small and declarative and very heavy. We. Not two separate people with separate problems that happen to rhyme. Something more combined than that, and newer. She closed the notebook. She walked back to town in the late afternoon with Button at her heels and the eggs tucked carefully in her bag, and she thought about what it meant to have someone in your corner who had gotten there the same way you'd gotten anywhere. Not because it was easy, not because someone had handed it to you, but because you'd both found the same road and walked it until you ran into each other. That night, at Florence's kitchen table, she wrote down what she wanted to say on Wednesday. She wrote it out 3 times. The first version was too careful, too hedged, too worried about being believed. The second was too angry, and anger without proof was just noise. The third was the one she kept. It said what was true. It said where it came from. It said what she thought people in the room needed to hear, in the plainest language she could manage. She folded it into her coat pocket. She went to bed and didn't sleep well, and didn't expect to. Wednesday arrived with the particular indifference of days that don't know they're significant. The sky was gray, the mud was its usual self, and the main street of Harlan Creek went about its business the way it always did. Clara worked through the morning, 2 fittings, a repair job, a new hem for Mrs. Halverson's eldest daughter who had grown 2 inches since November and was furious about it in the way only teenage girls can be furious about being taller. Petra came by in the afternoon and sat without being asked, the way she sometimes did when she had something to say. My father is coming tonight, Petra said, and my uncle, and our neighbor Mr. Bricks. She paused. We talked about it at dinner last night, and my father said he's worked alongside Cole Mercer at 2 brandings, and he's never seen a man who knew more about cattle. And my uncle said he'd heard your work at the Halverson Ranch was the best repair job those clothes had ever had. Another pause. I didn't ask them to come. They decided. Clara looked at her. I just thought you should know, Petra said. Clara put down what she was working on. She reached across the table and briefly, carefully squeezed Petra's hand. Petra went slightly pink and looked at the window. I should get back, Petra said. Mrs. Milligan needs the afternoon linens. She left. Clara watched her go down the front path with the particular walk of a girl who was trying to look like the things she'd just done hadn't meant anything to her, which meant it had meant quite a lot. Clara picked up her work again. An hour later, she set it down, folded it, and went to get ready for the evening. Outside, the sky had gone the flat, colorless gray of late Montana afternoon. Somewhere to the north, beyond the ridge, Cole Mercer's ranch sat in the same gray light. She thought about him getting ready. Not differently than she was getting ready, probably. Putting on the good coat, making the same calculation she was making about what this evening might cost and what it might require. She thought about the notebook, folded in her pocket alongside the speech. She thought about, we have something. She took a breath and went out to face the town. The courthouse in Harlan Creek held 60 people comfortably, and perhaps 80 if nobody was particular about their elbows. By the time Clara walked through the door at 10 minutes past 7 on Wednesday evening, there were already more than 70 people inside, with more coming in behind her, and the air had the close, warm, slightly combustible quality of a room where people had been talking for a while and had not yet agreed on anything. She stood at the back for a moment and took stock. She had learned in 12 years of fitting rooms and parlors and workshops that the first thing you do when you walk into any room is understand its geography. Where the power is sitting, where the sympathy is, where the people are who haven't made up their minds yet. The undecided ones were always the most important. The decided ones on both sides were already fixed. It was the uncertain middle that would determine what the evening became. Walter Goss was at the front of the room behind a long table with 2 other men she recognized as local landowners seated beside him. Gerald Pratt was not behind the table. He was in the front row of chairs, which was, she noted, a more careful position. He was letting Goss carry the official weight while remaining available to influence without appearing to be the one driving it. It was a competent arrangement. She gave him that. Florence was already seated near the middle of the room with a chair saved beside her. Dr. Dean was along the left wall, standing, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man attending an event he finds professionally offensive. She spotted Hector Farron, Cole's cattle buyer, near the back, a large, weathered man with a gray beard who was talking to two younger men she didn't know. Petra's father was there. She recognized him from Petra's description, a solid, square-faced farmer named Jonas Voss, sitting with his brother and the neighbor Brix, all three of them with the straight-backed posture of men who had decided before arriving what kind of evening they intended to have. And Cole was there. He was standing along the right wall, near the back, and he had positioned himself where he could see the entire room, the entrance, the table, the audience. He was watching faces the way he always watched faces, reading the room through what he could see of it. When Clara came in, he found her immediately. She wasn't sure how. The room was crowded and she wasn't large, but he found her, the way he always seemed to find her in a space. He gave her one small, deliberate nod. She crossed to Florence and sat down. "How many do you count on our side?" she asked, low, leaning close. "Dean, the Voss family, Farron, and his men, Burley if he comes, and Mrs. Lund. She sent word she'd be here, but I don't see her yet." Florence spoke quietly without moving her lips much, a skill Clara was beginning to appreciate. "Maybe 15 certain, another 20 who might go either way. And Goss has?" "The rest, plus the weight of the table." Clara unfolded the paper in her pocket and smoothed it against her knee without taking it all the way out, just touching it, making sure it was still there. Walter Goss called the meeting to order with a wooden gavel struck twice against the table. The room's noise went down by degrees, the way room noise always went down. Not all at once, but in waves, each wave a little quieter, until there was only the low creak of the building and someone's cough near the door. "Thank you all for coming," Goss said. He had a practiced public voice, not theatrical, but shaped for rooms, the voice of a man who had run many meetings. "This is a community welfare discussion, and I want to emphasize that nothing decided here tonight is final. We're here to talk. I want that understood." Some murmuring. Clara noted that he'd said nothing decided tonight is final, rather than nothing will be decided, a distinction that would probably go unnoticed by most of the room, but that she noticed. "This community has grown," Goss continued, "and with growth comes responsibility. It comes to my attention, and to the attention of others who care about the welfare of our residents, that there are individuals in Harlan Creek who may be in situations requiring some community support and guidance." He paused to let that settle. It was a smooth opening, nothing that sounded like attack, nothing anyone could object to directly. Clara had expected something like it. The language of welfare and guidance and community concern was a particular kind of camouflage, the kind that was hardest to fight, because fighting it made you sound like you were against welfare and concern. "I'd like to address two situations specifically," Goss said. He looked down at papers in front of him, which gave the impression of documentation without requiring him to cite any specific documents. "The first concerns a Miss Clara Whitmore, who arrived in our town approximately 2 months ago." Approximately half the room looked at Clara. The other half was too practiced in public meeting decorum to look, which meant they were thinking about looking. Clara kept her face level. She folded her hands in her lap. "Miss Whitmore arrived under, let's say, complicated circumstances," Goss said. "She traveled a considerable distance to enter into a marriage arrangement that did not materialize. She has remained in Harlan Creek since. Now, I want to say clearly," and here he used the tone of a man establishing fairness, "that Miss Whitmore has every right to stay, and her work in this community has been noted and appreciated by several residents." A small pause. "However, there are concerns about her capacity to navigate her situation effectively. She has a condition affecting her ability to communicate clearly. There is some question, raised by those who know her better than most, about whether she fully understands the social and practical challenges she faces here, and whether she might benefit from a more structured arrangement for her own protection." Gerald Pratt, in the front row, was looking at the table. He had the expression of a man attending a proceeding he had initiated but had the wisdom not to appear to have initiated. Clara's hands, folded in her lap, were very still. "The second situation," Goss said, "concerns Mr. Cole Mercer, who farms the North Pasture and has been a resident of this county for 12 years. He paused again. "Mr. Mercer is a capable man in many respects, and no one is disputing his work ethic. However, He operates in a state of complete auditory isolation, which raises legitimate questions about his ability to engage in the kinds of legal and business decisions that property ownership requires. There is also the matter of his recent association with Miss Whitmore, which some residents have found concerning given the particular vulnerabilities of both parties. Particular vulnerabilities, someone said from the left side of the room. Clara recognized Dr. Dean's voice. He hadn't raised his hand. Could you be specific about what vulnerabilities you're referring to, Walter? A small tension in the room. Goss looked at Dean with the expression of a man who had expected this but had hoped it would come later. I think the nature of their conditions is self-evident, Goss said. Nothing about medicine is self-evident, Dean said. That's why we have medicine. A few people in the room made sounds that might have been agreement or might have been nervousness. The two sounded similar in a public meeting. I'm not making a medical determination, Goss said carefully. Then what determination are you making? Dean asked. A social one, Goss said. A community welfare determination. Based on what criteria? Based on the observation of multiple residents over a period of time. Which residents? Goss looked down at his papers again. Several residents who have expressed concern and asked to remain unnamed, so as not to create interpersonal difficulty in the community. The room stirred. Clara caught Florence's eye briefly. Florence's expression said, unnamed sources. There it is. From the front row, Gerald Pratt said, apparently helpfully, apparently as a man simply contributing to a community discussion. I think what Walter is trying to convey is that this isn't about anyone's character. It's about capacity. The ability to make sound decisions in a challenging environment. Some people are more suited to that than others. There's no judgment in acknowledging that. He said it with the comfortable authority of a man who believes he is being reasonable. Hector Farron, at the back of the room, shifted in his seat with the movement of a large man containing himself. Jonas Voss said, without raising his hand, what does a placement arrangement actually mean? Practically speaking, Goss acknowledged him. There are facilities in the territory designed to provide supervised living arrangements for individuals who what? Voss said. Who may have difficulty managing their affairs independently. And who decides that? Who decides if someone's having difficulty? A panel of community representatives would. A panel you'd be sitting on, Voss said. That would be one option, Goss said evenly. And if someone was placed in one of these arrangements against their own preference, Voss said, what happens to their property? A silence that was different from the previous silences, heavier, with more weight to it. Goss said, property management would be handled by a designated trustee during the period of... A trustee, Voss said. Yes. Who would that be? That would be determined at the time? Would it be you? Voss asked. Or would it be Gerald Pratt? The room went very still. Pratt turned in his chair and looked at Jonas Voss with an expression of controlled offense. That's an unfair characterization of what we're trying to... I'm asking a question, Voss said. I'm not characterizing anything yet. Gentlemen, Goss said, and struck the table twice with his gavel. This is a welfare discussion, not an adversarial proceeding. I'd ask everyone to... Could I say something? Clara said. She said it at the level she could manage in a room this size, which was not loud. The people immediately around her heard it. Florence sat forward slightly. A few others near the middle turned toward her. Goss looked in her direction. He had the expression of a man recalculating. He had expected her to be present, probably, but he had perhaps not expected her to speak. Miss Whitmore, he said, not unkindly. Of course. I want this to be a discussion, please. Clara stood up. She unfolded the paper. The room was not quiet. It was the kind of almost quiet that still has 30 small sounds moving through it. People shifting, the building creaking, someone's chair scraping. And she knew, standing there, that her voice was not going to reach the back wall. It was never going to reach the back wall. That was simply what her voice was. She had spent a long time being angry about that, and had spent the last several years accepting it, and had spent the last 2 months in Harlan Creek deciding that acceptance was not the same as defeat. She spoke clearly and evenly and at the volume she had. My name is Clara Whitmore, she said. I'm 31 years old. I have been a working seamstress for 12 years. I came to Harlan Creek in March of this year to marry a man who then declined the arrangement when he heard my voice in person. I stayed because I am capable of determining where I live and what I do with my time, and my voice is not the part of me that makes those decisions. She could see the people nearest to her listening with the particular attention of people leaning in slightly, adjusting. Further back, she could see people who couldn't quite hear watching her face, reading what they could. I have not asked this community for anything, she continued. I have found work. I have honored every contract I've entered into. I have paid my rent and my bills on time, and I have caused no trouble to anyone. She paused. The concern being expressed about my capacity to manage my own affairs has not come from any difficulty I have actually had managing my affairs. It has come from a man standing at the front of this room who rejected me publicly and has spent the 2 months since then working to ensure that the town he lives in confirms the judgment he made about me on a train platform. She turned slightly so she was looking directly at Gerald Pratt. Pratt's expression went through several things quickly. I'm not going to ask you to take my word for that, Clara said. I'm going to ask you to look at what's actually being proposed here. A panel would determine whether I am capable of managing my own life. That panel would be composed of people selected by Walter Goss. If the determination went against me, a trustee would be assigned to manage my property and affairs. And that trustee would be named later at an unspecified time by an unspecified process. She folded the paper. She had memorized the rest. I'm asking you to consider whose interests that arrangement actually serves. She sat down. The room was in a kind of suspended condition, the particular suspended state of a crowd that has just heard something said plainly and is deciding how to receive it. Goss cleared his throat. I appreciate Miss Whitmore's passion, he said. I want to be clear that the proposal has never been... I want to say something about Cole Mercer, said Hector Farron from the back. Goss looked at him. Mr. Farron. Farron stood up. He was a large man, and standing up increased the effect of that. I've been buying cattle from Cole Mercer for 6 years, he said. I have never, not once, had a transaction with that man that wasn't straight, fair, and clear. He keeps his records better than most men with full hearing. He understands contracts. He understands land. He understands livestock in ways that some men spend their whole lives trying to learn and never do. He paused. I don't know what problem you're trying to solve with Cole Mercer, but the problem isn't his. Someone in the room made an approving sound. Someone else made a sound that disagreed with that sound. Nobody is disputing Mr. Mercer's professional capabilities, Goss began. Then what are you disputing? Farron asked. His ability to engage fully in civic and legal processes that require He's here, isn't he? Farron said. He came to this meeting. He's watching every face in this room. You want to tell me he doesn't know what's being said about him right now? Goss looked at Cole. Cole was looking back at Goss with the flat, patient expression of a man who had seen everything in this room before. Not this specific room, but this specific situation. This specific flavor of people deciding things about him as though he weren't present. He did not look confused. He did not look lost. He looked exactly like what he was, a man sitting in a room, watching, waiting for people to finish doing something he found both predictable and tiresome. I'd like to say something, said a new voice. It was Mrs. Lund. She had come in at some point without Clara noticing, and she was standing near the left wall in her coat and her hard, practical expression. She did not wait for Goss to acknowledge her. I am 71 years old, she said, in her accented, unapologetic way. I have been a seamstress since I was 9. I know the difference between good work and bad work. She looked at Clara. Miss Whitmore does good work. That is a full assessment of a person's capacity if you know anything about work. A few people laughed, not mockingly, but with the releasing quality of genuine amusement. Pratt said, from his seat, I think everyone's missing the fundamental point, which is that this proposal comes from a place of genuine concern. For whose benefit is it genuinely, Dr. Dean said. For the individuals involved. Then let's ask the individuals, Dean said. He looked at Clara. Miss Whitmore, do you believe you require a community panel to manage your affairs? No, Clara said. Clear, short, direct. Dean looked at Cole. Cole had been watching Dean's face during the exchange. He had followed enough of it, from faces, from the body language of the room, from the general shape of the proceedings, to know where they were. When Dean looked at him and spoke, He could not hear the words, but Dean was thoughtful enough to hold his gaze and speak with enough clarity of expression that Cole could read the shape of the question. Cole looked back at Dean for a moment, then he reached into his coat and took out a notebook. Not Clara's notebook, his own, which she'd found out he carried separately, and he wrote something and held it up for the room to see. He had written, in large, clear letters, "No." A sound went through the room. Pratt said, with a careful reasonableness that was doing a great deal of work, "It's admirable that they feel confident, but feeling confident isn't the same as being capable of—" "Gerald," Florence Acker said. She had not spoken until now, and her voice, when she used it, was the voice of a woman who had been quiet for a long time and had finally calculated that speaking was worth the cost. "Gerald," she said again, "I have lived in this town for 18 years. I watched you underprice and undercut every dry goods competitor who tried to set up here until they gave up and left. I watched you sit on the town improvement committee and make sure every contract went to businesses you had personal interests in. And I watched you stand on a train platform 2 months ago and humiliate a woman in front of strangers because she didn't meet your specifications." She paused. "I am telling this room that your concern for these two people's welfare is the most recent story in a long story about what Gerald Pratt considers his." The room went into the deep silence that follows the saying of something true in public. Pratt's face had gone through several colors. He found his voice with the effort of a man pulling something heavy. "That is a personal attack, and it has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with it," Florence said. She sat back down. Chug. The meeting did not end cleanly. Meetings like that one almost never did. They ended the way weather systems ended, gradually, with a lot of time spent on procedural questions and follow-up suggestions, and carefully worded assurances from Goss that nothing had been formally decided, and the discussion would continue at a later date, which was the language of retreat dressed as patience. By 9 o'clock, the room was emptying. No vote had been taken. The placement arrangement had not been formally proposed or formally abandoned. Goss had adjourned with the language of a man who needed to reassess his position without saying so. Clara stood near the door as people filed past. Several of them looked at her, some with the avoidance of people who had sat on the wrong side of the room and now preferred not to engage, and some with something different. A woman she didn't know touched her arm briefly as she passed, not saying anything. Jonas Voss nodded at her on his way out with the substantial nod of a man saying, "Well done," in the economy of gesture that men like him used for everything that mattered. Burley, who had come in late, she'd seen him slip through the back door during the meeting, stopped beside her and said, in his theatrical murmur, "You should have been on the stage, Miss Whitmore." "I could barely be heard past the 4th row," she said. "The 4th row heard everything they needed to," Burley said. "Sometimes it's the people in the front who matter least." He went out. Cole found her last. He came through the thinning crowd and stopped in front of her, and for a moment they just stood there in the emptying room with the sound of other people's departures around them. She took out the notebook. She wrote, "How much did you catch?" He wrote, "Enough. Farron, Mrs. Lund, Florence Acker." A pause, then, "You. I don't know if it helped." He wrote, "It helped. Goss didn't take a vote. That's not what he planned to do tonight. He'll try again." "Probably," he wrote. "But now people in the room know what it is. That's different than before." She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. She wrote, "I was scared. Standing up, my hands were shaking." He took the notebook and read that. He held the pencil for a long moment. Then he wrote, "I know, I could tell. You did it anyway." Was it obvious, the shaking? "Only to someone watching very carefully," he wrote. She looked at him. "Were you watching very carefully?" she wrote. He met her eyes. There was nothing ambiguous in his face, none of the calculated distance he kept between himself and most of the world. Just the same quiet directness she had come to recognize as his particular way of being honest. "Yes," he wrote. She handed the notebook back to him without writing anything else. There are some things that don't need a response, that are, in fact, diminished by one. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold Montana night, and the stars were out in the particular extravagant way that Montana stars came out, when there was no cloud, in numbers that a person from a city could never quite adjust to, and the mud on the main street had gone hard in the night cold, and the town was quiet around them. The days after the meeting had their own peculiar quality. Nothing formal had changed. Goss had not withdrawn his proposal, had not advanced it. He had issued a kind of public non-statement, a notice posted at the courthouse and the feed store that read, "The community welfare discussion of April 14th is adjourned pending further review. Residents are encouraged to continue bringing their concerns to the Justice's office." It was a careful piece of language that could mean almost anything and committed to nothing. But something had shifted in the town's texture. It was not a complete shift. Clara was not naive enough to mistake one meeting for a revolution. There were still people at the dry goods store who looked at her sideways when she passed. There were still conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, and she could not always tell whether they stopped because people liked her or because they were uncomfortable around her. And the two had very different implications. Pratt was still in his store, still running his business, still the most economically significant individual in Harlan Creek. But the 40-odd people who had been in that room had all gone home and talked to their households, and those households had talked to their neighbors. And the thing that Florence had said, the naming of the pattern, the 18 years of watching, the platform humiliation stated plainly, had a life of its own now that was outside Gerald Pratt's ability to manage. He knew it. She could see it in the way he moved on the main street now, with slightly more deliberateness than before. The way a man moves when he is aware that he is being watched and is managing his appearance accordingly. She was watched differently now, too, but watched as a subject of genuine interest, which was different from watched as a subject of assessment. Mrs. Halverson, the one who had said the dresses looked like feed sacks with aspirations, stopped her on the street 4 days after the meeting. "I heard what you said in there," Mrs. Halverson said. She was a tall woman, forthright, with the plain expression of someone who didn't do much with her face that she didn't mean. "About why you stayed, after Pratt." "Yes," Clara said. "That took something," Mrs. Halverson said. Not warmly, exactly. More like a professional assessment. "My daughter wants to know if you can make her a dress for the spring social. I told her I'd ask." Clara looked at her. "I can," she said. "Have her come Tuesday morning." Mrs. Halverson nodded. "Tuesday," she said, and walked on. Clara watched her go. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of alliance. It was a woman asking about a dress. But in this town, at this particular time, a woman asking about a dress was its own kind of statement, and Clara knew how to receive those. She kept working. With Cole, the meeting had done something unexpected. It had closed a distance that the notebook had been slowly closing but hadn't finished. There was less performance now in their time together, less of the careful management of impression that people maintain when they're still figuring out how much the other person can be trusted. Something about having stood in the same room, against the same thing, even from different walls, had settled an agreement between them that hadn't been there quite as solidly before. He came to Florence's house for the first time on a Thursday afternoon. He had a pair of canvas work pants that needed a significant repair at the knee, something he'd caught on a fence post during branding. And he'd been managing them with a rough patch that Clara had noticed on the creek road and told him, in the notebook, was an insult to the original workmanship. Florence opened the door to him and showed him in with the matter-of-fact courtesy she extended to everyone, and he stood in her front room with his hat in his hands, looking at the organized chaos of Clara's work spread across every flat surface. The dress forms, the stacked fabric, the thread organization system she'd built from a series of old tobacco tins, with the expression of a man taking inventory. She was at the work table. She stood up and they exchanged the notebook. "You came. You said Tuesday or Thursday. I said that about the knee repair. I didn't know if you'd actually—" "You said it. I wrote it down." She looked at him. "You wrote it down. I write things down." "I know. Yes, sit there. I'll need the pants off the leg at some point to get the measurement right." He sat. Florence came through at one point with tea and set it down on the table nearest him without making a thing of it, which was, Clara thought, one of the things she liked best about Florence. Her refusal to treat anything unusual as unusual when treating it as unusual would have been unkind. She worked on the pants while he drank his tea and looked out the window at Florence's back garden, which was just beginning to show the small, stubborn green of early spring. At one point, Florence's cat, an enormous gray animal named Possibly, because Florence had found her under circumstances suggesting she might or might not be a permanent arrangement, climbed onto Cole's leg and went to sleep. Cole looked down at the cat. He looked at Clara. She was already writing in the notebook. That's possibly. She doesn't usually like strangers. He wrote back, "Animals don't think I'm strange." "No? I don't make unexpected noises. They find it restful." She looked at that and felt the same thing she sometimes felt reading his sentences. A laugh catching in her chest, the kind of surprised laugh that came when something landed differently than expected. She fixed the pants. He left. Florence said nothing about it, which, given Florence's usual relationship with comment, was itself a form of comment. That night, in her room, Clara sat for a long time at the window without doing anything in particular. Button was asleep on the foot of her bed, which she had not invited but had stopped preventing. The spring night was cold and clear, and the town was quiet. She was not accustomed to sitting doing nothing. She had not had the habit of stillness for most of her adult life. There had always been work, always something to occupy the hands and justify the existence. But she sat for a while with nothing in her hands and let herself think about what was actually happening, which was something she had been too busy and too careful to do directly. She was, she thought, possibly falling in love with Cole Mercer, or something in the direction of that. It was not the sharp, sudden fall of the novels she'd read in Philadelphia. It was slower than that, more like a gradual realization that something important was already present and had been for some time. Like looking up from your work and finding the light had changed without you noticing. She was not entirely sure what to do with this. It was one more complicated thing in a situation that was already complicated, in a town that was already watching, with a man who proposed things by setting up notebooks and bringing eggs rather than by saying them directly, and she did not know with certainty what he felt or whether restful meant something more than a preference for quiet company. She sat at the window and did not resolve any of this, and eventually went to bed. The shift in Pratt's campaign, when it came, arrived from a direction she had not quite expected. She had expected him to try Goss again. Another meeting, a revised proposal, something more formally structured and harder to refuse. What she had not expected was the personal approach. She was leaving Mrs. Lund's workroom on a Friday afternoon when Pratt appeared on the walk in front of her. He was alone, without the particular purposefulness of a man who had arranged an encounter, which made her think he actually hadn't, that he had been coming from the opposite direction and had rounded the corner, and there she was, and he had made a decision in half a second. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She stopped. "Mr. Pratt." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, not the hostile assessment she expected, but something more complicated, something that might, in another man, have been a preliminary to an apology. "The meeting," he said. "The things Mrs. Acker said." "I think Mrs. Acker said accurate things," Clara said. "Some of them were characterizations," he said carefully, "of my motives, that I consider unfair." "Then perhaps the way to address that," Clara said, "is to behave in ways that make the characterizations inaccurate." He looked at her. His jaw shifted slightly, the way jaws shift when people are deciding whether to argue a point or abandon it. "Your attachment to Mercer," he said. "People are talking about it." "People were talking about me before my attachment to Mr. Mercer," Clara said. "That wasn't a problem I caused. It creates complications." "For whom?" she asked. He was quiet. "Mr. Pratt," she said, and she kept her voice even with some effort. "I am not going to stop being what I am or doing what I'm doing because it creates complications for other people's expectations. I tried that for 30 years and it didn't improve anyone's situation, including mine." She paused. "Good afternoon." She walked past him. He said, behind her, "You should know that Goss intends to formally file the welfare determination. He's going to move it to the county level, which takes it out of this town entirely." She stopped. Her back was to him. She made herself breathe once before she turned around. He was still there, looking at her with the expression of a man who had just revealed something and was not entirely sure why he'd done it. "When?" she said. "Within the month," he said, "if nothing changes." "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. The silence between them was its own kind of answer. Not the answer either of them would have put into words, but a true one. A man who had done a thing badly and had been told so in public, possibly reconsidering the shape of what he'd started. "Consider it a professional courtesy," Pratt said. He put his hat on and walked away. Clara stood on the street for a long moment after he left. Then she turned and walked toward the creek road. She needed to find Cole. He was at the north end of the creek road, coming toward town. He had a habit of timing his trips to town in the late afternoon, something she'd noticed without thinking much about it until recently, when she'd understood that the timing coincided with when she was usually coming back from Mrs. Lund's. She took out the notebook without preamble and wrote what Pratt had told her. Cole read it, standing in the road with the late light on his face. He read it twice. Then he stood for a moment with the notebook in his hands, looking at the middle distance in the way he did when he was thinking something through. He wrote, "County level. That's Judge Aldrin in Millbrook. Goss would need documentation. Witnesses. He has Pratt. Pratt and who else, she thought. He has the unnamed residents from the meeting. Who are? I don't know." He wrote, "We need to know." And then, after a pause, "We also need to be faster than they are. What does that mean?" He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face, not nervousness, but the look of a man who has been holding something carefully and is deciding whether to put it down. He wrote, "It means that if this goes to county, 2 individuals with separate situations are less defensible than 2 individuals who have made a formal arrangement." Clara looked at that sentence for a long time. She looked up at him. He was watching her face with the patient, careful attention he always gave her, reading what he could, waiting. She wrote slowly, "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He took the notebook. He wrote, "I'm saying it badly. Let me say it better." She waited. He wrote, "I am asking if you would consider marrying me. Not as a strategy, or not only as a strategy. I want to be honest about both things." Clara read that. She read it again. The creek was running fast beside them. Button had put his nose into the water and pulled it back out in the offended way he always did, as though surprised every time that the creek was wet. The light was going down behind the ridge in long horizontal lines of copper and gray. She wrote, "Not only as a strategy." He wrote, "No." She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing in the middle of a muddy road in the middle of Montana, with a notebook between them and a limping dog at their feet, and a town behind them that was still in the process of deciding what it thought of both of them, and none of that was an ideal set of conditions for this particular conversation. She wrote, "I need to think about it, of course. Not because I don't—" She stopped. She crossed out what she'd started. She wrote instead, "Give me a day." He nodded. He handed her the notebook. She walked back toward town. She didn't look back, but she heard him stay where he was for a while. She couldn't hear him. No one could hear a man standing still, but she felt it, the particular weight of someone not leaving. She walked with the creek sound beside her and the question in her hands like the notebook she was holding, heavy and specific and real. She had one day to answer it. She did not sleep that night either, but this time it was different from the sleeplessness before the courthouse meeting. That had been the sleeplessness of dread, the anticipatory exhaustion of someone preparing for something that might go badly. This was quieter and more complicated than dread. This was the sleeplessness of a woman sitting with a question that was actually 2 questions, and knowing she needed to answer both of them honestly before she could answer either one out loud. The first question was the practical one. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over a garment before cutting, looking for the grain, the bias, the places where the fabric would pull if you didn't account for them. County jurisdiction meant Judge Aldrin in Millbrook, 60 miles north. It meant formal documentation, sworn witnesses, a legal process that neither she nor Cole could fight effectively as isolated individuals against the institutional weight of a justice of the peace with the landowner's resources behind him. Cole had put it plainly, as he always put things plainly. 2 individuals with separate situations were less defensible than 2 who had made a formal arrangement. He was right about that. She was clear-eyed enough to say so, but the second question was the one she lay awake with longer, because it required a different kind of honesty. Not the strategic kind, but the interior kind, the kind that a person could avoid for a long time by staying busy and keeping their hands occupied with work. She had been very busy since arriving in Harlan Creek. She had been extraordinarily good at keeping her hands occupied. She thought about the creek road, and the wire cutters, and 3 eggs wrapped in cloth. She thought about sitting on the bank of the creek watching him think before he wrote, and the way his face had gone unguarded for a half second when Button licked it. She thought about, I know, I could tell. You did it anyway. She thought about only to someone watching very carefully. The second question, honestly answered, was not actually a question. It had an answer she'd been aware of for some time. She had been managing it, the way you manage a thing you're not sure you're allowed to have. She got up at 5 and dressed in the dark, and went down to Florence's kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with it and Button at her feet and the pre-dawn quiet of a frontier town all around her. And she thought about what it meant to make a decision that was both practical and true at the same time. By the time Florence came down at 6:30, Clara had been sitting with her answer for over an hour. Florence looked at her face and said without preamble, "You've decided something." "I have." Florence poured her own coffee and sat down. She waited. "Cole asked me to marry him," Clara said, "on the road yesterday." Florence was quiet for a moment. "And?" "I told him I needed a day." "And?" Clara looked at her coffee. "I'm going to say yes." Florence was quiet for a longer moment this time. Clara looked up at her. Florence's expression was not the expression of someone surprised. It was the expression of someone who has been watching a thing develop from the beginning and is now watching it arrive. "Good," Florence said. Just that. Then she drank her coffee. "There are about 40 things that could go wrong," Clara said. "Of course there are," Florence said. "That's true of everything worth doing." Clara looked at the table for a moment. "Do you think—" She stopped. "What?" "Do you think he means it, not only as a strategy?" Florence set her cup down. "Clara, I have watched that man walk 2 miles out of his way 3 times a week to happen to be on the same road as you. And I've watched him bring eggs that he absolutely did not need to bring. And I watched him sit in my front room with possibly asleep on his leg, drinking tea and looking out my garden window like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be." She paused. "He means it." Clara breathed out slowly. "The question," Florence said, "is whether you mean it." "I do," Clara said. Quiet, but certain. Florence nodded once. "Then go tell him, before you talk yourself into a 3rd day of thinking about it." She walked the creek road in the early morning with the light just coming up gold and gray over the eastern ridge and Button at her heels, making his usual optimistic assessment of every smell he encountered. The mud had hardened again overnight, and the walking was good, and the air was cold in the clean, particular way of Montana spring mornings that had nothing apologetic about them. Cole was already there. She had not expected that, had expected to walk to the ranch, had been preparing herself for the additional 2 miles. But he was there at the usual bend in the road where their paths crossed, sitting on the fence rail that ran along the north field, looking at the ridge. He had a coffee tin in his hands, which meant he'd come from the ranch recently. He was not pretending to be there for any other reason. He saw her coming and got off the fence rail. He did not reach for the notebook immediately. He just watched her walk toward him with the attentive, patient expression she had come to know. She stopped in front of him. She took out the notebook and wrote one word. "Yes." She held it up. He read it. He was still for a moment, the particular stillness of someone receiving something they wanted and taking a second to let it be real. Then something happened in his face, slow and unperformed and genuine, not the controlled expression he kept for the world, but the thing underneath it, which was warmer and less defended, and which she had only seen a few times before. He took the notebook from her hand. He wrote, "Yes to both things?" She took it back. "Yes to both things." He nodded. He put the notebook in his coat pocket. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who does nothing carelessly, he reached out and took her hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was just a hand holding hers on a muddy road in the early morning. But she felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of a thing that had been moving toward this point for months and had now arrived. They stood like that for a while, with the creek running and the light coming up, and Button investigating the fence post with professional interest. Then she took out the notebook one more time. She wrote, "We should tell people before Goss files anything. Make it known in town first." He read it. He wrote, "Agreed." "How fast?" "This week." "There's the Friday social at Burley's Theater." She looked at him. "You know about the Friday social? I pay attention." She looked at that. Then she wrote, "We could go together." He wrote, "That seems right. People will talk." People are already talking, he wrote. Let them talk about something true, Mads. The thing about Harlan Creek, Clara had come to understand, was that it was not a single entity. It presented itself as one thing, a town, a community, a unified face. But it was actually a collection of maybe 15 or 20 different opinion clusters that sometimes moved together and sometimes didn't. And the direction the whole thing moved depended almost entirely on which clusters were talking to each other in any given week. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday in deliberate motion. She told Florence officially, who said good again and immediately began rearranging her mental furniture to accommodate the new situation. She told Petra, who went through approximately 4 emotional stages in 30 seconds. Surprise, delight, worry on Clara's behalf, and back to delight. And who then went home and told her father, who told the neighbor Bricks, who apparently told half the farming families within 5 miles by Thursday noon. She told Dr. Dean, who shook her hand with genuine warmth and said, Cole Mercer is one of the more competent people in this county, and I think you are fully his equal in that, and I wish you both well. Then he added, with the frankness of a doctor, You understand this doesn't eliminate the Goss problem. I know, Clara said, but it changes the shape of it. It changes the shape of it considerably, Dean agreed. A married woman has legal standing, her husband's property interests can be associated with, and a married man with a productive ranch and a working wife is a considerably harder person to paint as incapable of managing his own affairs. That's what we thought, Clara said. Dean looked at her. I want to say something. Please. I've watched you operate in this town for 3 months, he said. The strategic thinking you're doing, the reading of the situation, the timing, the decision-making. These are not the actions of a person who requires community management of her affairs. I want you to know I will say that under oath to any judge in this territory. Clara held that for a moment. Thank you, Dr. Dean. Don't thank me, he said. It's just accurate. She went to see Hector Farron on Wednesday afternoon, which required riding out to his property on a horse she borrowed from Florence's neighbor, which was itself an adventure since she was a competent but not naturally graceful rider, and the horse had opinions. Farron received her in his barn, which smelled of hay and animals, and the particular combination that always made Clara think of honest work. You're marrying Cole, Farron said before she'd said it. He said it the way farmers said most things. Flat, observational, already 2 steps past surprise. Word travels fast, she said. Good word travels faster than bad word in my experience. He was working on a harness while he talked, his hands not stopping. Goss is going to file. Cole told me you said it was a land grab and a charitable coat. Farron glanced up at her. I said it to the room. I'll say it to a judge. Would you? Cole Mercer has been my most reliable cattle supplier for 6 years, Farron said. If Goss manages to tie up his land in a trusteeship, that affects my operation. So yes, I'll say it to a judge. I'd say it to the governor if it came to that. She thanked him and rode the opinionated horse back to town with the late afternoon light on the fields around her. By Thursday evening, Clara estimated that at least 60 people in Harlan Creek knew she and Cole were planning to marry. She could not be certain of the spread's exact shape. Information moved in organic ways in small towns, pooling in some places and skipping others, but she knew it had reached the significant clusters, the farming families, the professional class, the women's networks that ran along different lines than the men's but covered fully as much ground. What she did not know, and could not know until Friday, was whether it had reached Gerald Pratt, and what he intended to do about it. Awesome. The Friday social at Burley's Theater was a monthly event through spring and summer. The theater company was not performing that weekend, so the space was given over to a general community gathering. It was informal enough to mean most people in town had some reason to be there, and formal enough to mean people dressed for it. Clara wore the blue wool dress, which she had altered twice since arriving in Harlan Creek, and which now fit her correctly in a way it hadn't even when she'd first made it. Florence had lent her a brooch, a small practical piece with a dark stone in it, and had said nothing about it beyond pressing it into Clara's hand that morning. Cole arrived at Florence's door at 7, which was when the social started, which meant he had looked up what time the social started and organized himself accordingly. He was in his best coat, dark, well-fitted, clearly made by someone who knew what they were doing, with his hat in his hands, and he looked at Clara for a moment in the doorway with the expression of a man who was not going to say what he was thinking because some things didn't require saying. Florence, behind Clara, said, You both look very presentable, with the tone of someone who means considerably more than that and chooses not to elaborate. They walked to the theater together on the hardened mud of the main street, with half a block between them and the building and the yellow light from Burley's lamps visible through the windows. The evening was cold and clear. Clara's breath made small clouds. "Are you nervous?" she wrote in the notebook before they went in. He read it and wrote, "Yes." "Are you?" "Yes." He wrote, "Good. It means we understand what this is." She looked at him. He tucked the notebook into his pocket and held the door open. They walked in together. The room had maybe 50 people in it, which, for Burley's space, was comfortably full, and the noise of it, conversation, movement, the small orchestra of social sound that Harlan Creek generated when assembled, went through the usual adjustment when she and Cole entered. Not silence, just a shift, a reorientation, the room finding its new center of attention and calibrating. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. What she had not entirely prepared for was the speed with which the recalibration happened. The quick read that went through the room as people processed what they were seeing, and the way it resolved differently depending on who was looking. Florence was there already and caught her eye from across the room with a small nod. Farron was near the back with his wife, who looked at them with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. Petra, who had somehow gotten her parents' permission to attend, materialized at Clara's elbow within 30 seconds, vibrating with the suppressed energy of a teenager at an event she finds historically significant. "Half the room knew already," Petra murmured. "The other half just figured it out from the way you walked in." "How did we walk in?" Clara asked. "Like you intended to," Petra said, and moved away with the dignity of someone delivering information and not requiring a receipt. Dr. Dean appeared, shook Cole's hand with the direct, confident grip of a man who has thought about what this handshake means and means it, and said, to Cole's face, with the clear articulation of someone who had learned to speak to be read, "Glad you're here, Cole. Glad you're both here." Cole nodded. Something in his posture, which had carried the controlled readiness of a man expecting trouble, shifted slightly. Gerald Pratt was there. Clara saw him at the same time he saw her. He was with Walter Goss at the far side of the room, near the refreshment table, and the two of them had the configuration of men in the middle of a conversation that had just been interrupted by an external event. Pratt's expression went through a quick recalculation. Goss's went through a different one. The expression of someone doing math. They did not come over. They stayed at the far side of the room. For perhaps 20 minutes, the social operated on two levels simultaneously. The surface level of a normal community gathering, people talking and moving and drinking the weak punch Burley always served at these things, and the undertow level of a room in which something unresolved was still moving. Clara talked to Mrs. Halverson's daughter about the dress, which was going well and would be ready within 2 weeks. She talked to Mrs. Lund about a spring order from the miller's wife. Cole talked to Farron. They had their own communication, worked out over years, a combination of lip reading and gesture, and the shorthand of two men who knew each other's business well enough to get most of it across without words. Then Walter Goss crossed the room. He came directly, which she respected as a choice. No circling. He stopped in front of her and Cole both, which meant he'd made the calculation that he wasn't going to pretend the situation was something other than what it was. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Cole." He nodded at them both. "I've heard there's a development." "That's right," Clara said. Goss looked at her voice, the way people always looked at her voice, the half-second recalibration, and then past that. "You understand that a marital arrangement doesn't automatically resolve the welfare concerns I've raised. I understand that you'll represent it that way," Clara said. "I'd ask you to also consider how a county judge is going to receive a welfare filing against two individuals who are operating a successful seamstress business and a productive cattle ranch, who have the support of the community doctor and several of the county's primary landowners, and who have just formalized their own legal arrangement without any assistance from a community panel." Goss was quiet for a moment. "The concerns about Mr. Mercer's capacity," he started. "Walter," said Hector Farron, who had moved close enough to hear, "I've got 6 years of contracts with Cole Mercer that I'll carry to Millbrook personally if you file. Every one of them clean, legal, and correctly executed." He paused. "You want to make that argument to Judge Aldrin? You're welcome to. I'll be there." Goss looked at Farron. He looked back at Clara. He said carefully, "I'm not interested in a proceeding that can't succeed." "Then I'd think carefully about whether this one can," Clara said. Another silence. Goss looked at Cole. Cole was watching his face with the steady patience of a man who had been in many rooms like this, who knew what it meant when the room shifted and how to stay still while it happened. Goss nodded, once, a small and undecorated acknowledgement. Then he turned and went back across the room to where Pratt was standing. Farron said to no one in particular, "Well, that wasn't so bad." "It's not over," Clara said. "No," Farron agreed, "but it went the right direction." "'Tis." She had not expected Pratt to approach her a second time that evening. She had thought the Goss conversation was the event, the thing the room had been building toward, and that everything after it would be resolution, people dispersing, the social settling back into its ordinary rhythms. But 20 minutes later, while Cole was across the room with Farron and Clara was standing near the window with her punch that she hadn't drunk, Pratt appeared at her elbow. He looked different from the last time they'd spoken on the street. Not softened exactly. Gerald Pratt did not soften. It was not in his construction, but something had shifted in the architecture of his expression. The certainty was not entirely there. Miss Whitmore," he said, catching himself on the title. "Mr. Pratt?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his punch glass in his hands. "Cole Mercer's ranch," he said. "The North Pasture." "What about it?" "I've made him 3 offers on that land in the past 2 years. He said it plainly, not defensively, just stating it. He refused all 3. "I know," she said. "He told me." "The land is worth more than I offered," Pratt said. "I knew that when I made the offers. I was hoping he wouldn't." He paused. "He knew." She looked at him. "I want you to know," Pratt said, "that the welfare proposal, the placement discussion, I believed some of it when we started. I want to say that." He stopped again. He seemed to be working toward something and not finding it easily. "I believed the voice was a problem. I genuinely believed that. I'm not telling you it was right, I'm telling you it was what I thought." "And the rest of it?" Clara asked. Her voice was even. She was not going to help him with this. "The rest of it," he said, "was Goss, who had his own interests, as you've identified. I was useful to his purpose." He looked at his glass. "That's not a comfortable thing to recognize about yourself." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was measuring something. Not forgiveness. She was not there and might not get there, but something more practical. Whether this was real or another layer of strategy, whether a man like Gerald Pratt was capable of this kind of plain statement for its own sake. "I told Goss this afternoon," Pratt said, "that I'm withdrawing my support for the filing." She went still. "I can't stop him filing independently," Pratt said. "But without my support, without the named witnesses I was prepared to provide, he has very little to take to Millbrook." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to think well of me. I don't suppose you have reason to. I'm telling you what I've done and why, so you know what the situation actually is." She stood with this for a moment. She said, "The platform, the things you said." "Yes," he said. "That was public. The damage from it was public." "Yes," he said again. He did not argue or qualify. The honesty of it, the absence of self-justification, was the most surprising thing he had done in the entire 3 months she'd known him. "If Goss files without you," she said, "what are his actual chances?" "Slim," Pratt said. "Without my testimony about your arrival circumstances and without the property interest angle, which requires my cooperation to frame, he's got vague community concern and nothing more." He paused. "Judge Aldrin is not a man who rules on vague community concern. He's a man who rules on evidence." Clara thought about this. She thought about Farron's 6 years of contracts. She thought about Dr. Dean, who had said under oath to any judge in this territory. She thought about Jonas Voss and his brother and neighbor Bricks sitting in the courthouse with their straight-backed certainty. "Why are you telling me this tonight?" she asked. "Why not just withdraw quietly and let it play out?" Pratt looked at her. "Because you've been here 3 months, he said. "And in 3 months you've done more clearly useful things in this town than I've seen arrive on that train in 5 years. And because—" He stopped, and something in his face was briefly unguarded. Because the things Florence Acker said were accurate, and I knew they were accurate when she said them. And a man who can't correct himself when he knows he's wrong isn't worth the reputation he's worked to build. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I'll tell Cole." Pratt nodded. He started to turn away. Then he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "about the voice, I was wrong about that. I was wrong about what it meant and what it was." He looked at her steadily. "You speak more plainly than most people I've dealt with, and you do it with a damaged voice in a room full of people who weren't inclined to listen. That's not the voice of someone who can't represent herself." He set his punch glass on the window ledge and walked back across the room. Clara stood for a moment watching him go. She found Cole by the door where he and Farron had finished their conversation, and she took out the notebook and wrote quickly, standing up, her handwriting less neat than usual. She told him about Pratt. She told him all of it. He read it twice. He looked up at her. He wrote, "He withdrew. Yes, that changes the filing substantially. Yes, I think so." He stood for a moment, looking at the room, at Pratt, across it, who was talking to someone and not looking back. At Goss, who was near the door and whose expression, now, had the flattened quality of a man reassessing his position in private. At the rest of the room, 50 people who had various opinions and had come to have them revised by a single Friday evening. Cole wrote, "What do you think he'll do?" Goss. "I think he calculates," Clara wrote. "And the calculation has changed." Cole looked at that. He wrote, "Then it's over?" "I don't know if it's over," she wrote honestly, "but it's different." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She wrote, "When do you want to do this?" "The marriage." He wrote without hesitation, "As soon as the law allows. That's probably 3 days for the paperwork." 3 days, he wrote. She looked at him. She thought about the train platform 3 months ago and a man turning his back in front of strangers. She thought about $14.60 and a trunk in the mud. She thought about everything between that moment and this one. The work, the road, the notebook, the courthouse meeting, possibly the cat asleep on Cole's leg, eggs wrapped in cloth, yes to both things. 3 days, she wrote back. All right. They were married on a Monday morning at the county clerk's office, which was the practical location for such things, and which had none of the ceremony that stories usually required of significant moments. The clerk was a brisk man named Otto, who had processed many marriages and treated this one with the flat efficiency he brought to everything, which was, Clara thought, actually appropriate. She did not want pageantry. She wanted a document. Florence was there. Farron was there, as a witness. Petra had asked to come, and Clara had said yes, and Petra stood through the whole thing with the rigid composure of a girl, trying very hard not to show that she found this deeply moving. The clerk read the required language. Clara said yes when asked. Cole said yes when asked, or, more precisely, when the clerk, with the practiced adaptation of a man who had thought about this in advance, held up the form for him to read and indicated the signature line, Cole signed it and nodded once with a clarity that required no further interpretation. Otto stamped the certificate with the county seal. That was it. Outside, on the courthouse steps in the thin spring sunlight, Petra finally gave up on composure and hugged Clara with the whole-body enthusiasm of someone who has been holding that in for 3 days. Clara held on for a moment, surprised by how much the contact landed, the uncomplicated warmth of it, the kind of affection that had no conditions attached. Farron shook Cole's hand and said something to his face that Clara couldn't read from the angle, but Cole laughed. Actually laughed, a real and startled one, which she made a note to ask about later. Florence stood at Clara's elbow as the others moved toward the street. "All right?" Florence said. "Yes," Clara said. "The house is yours for as long as you need it," Florence said. "While you get the ranch sorted, I have no plans to need that room." Clara looked at her. "You've been—" She stopped. She was not a woman who found gratitude easy to say directly. "You've been more than—" "Oh, stop," Florence said, without unkindness. "I've had good company for 3 months and a great deal of excellent sewing done in my front room. We're even." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she reached over and briefly squeezed her hand, the same way she'd done with Petra weeks ago. Florence squeezed back, once, hard. They walked down the steps into the morning. It was Thursday, 3 days after the marriage, a week after the Friday social, when Goss posted a second notice at the courthouse. Clara read it from the main street when she passed. It was 4 lines. It stated that the community welfare discussion of the previous month was formally closed. It stated that the Justice's office had reviewed the available documentation and determined that no formal filing to county would be submitted at this time. It stated that residents with ongoing community concerns were welcome to bring them to the Justice's office during regular hours. 4 lines. The end of 2 months of careful, systematic campaign to remove 2 people from the lives they had built, dressed in the language of concern and welfare and community good, concluded in 4 lines because the architecture holding it up had been pulled out from under it. Clara stood on the main street and read it twice. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something more like triumph, and was slightly surprised by the absence of it. What she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a long effort finally released, the muscles letting go of a tension they've held so long they'd stopped noticing it. And underneath that, something quieter and more durable. Something like the feeling she got when a seam ran true from end to end, when the grain was right and the tension was even and the thing she'd made was going to hold. She took out the notebook. She wrote, "It's closed. He posted it this morning." She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she folded the notebook and put it in her pocket. She would show Cole later, on the road. She had work to do. She turned from the notice board and walked back toward Florence's house, and the mud on the main street was soft with spring warmth today, and Button, who had been waiting for her at a respectful distance from the courthouse, because he had learned that official buildings required patience, fell into step beside her. The town moved around her, ordinary, alive, imperfect, continuing. A man loading a wagon outside the feed store. 2 women in conversation near the milliners. The sound of the school building, children's voices coming through the open window. A teacher saying something she couldn't quite make out. Harlan Creek in the middle of a Thursday morning, going about its business. She was part of it now. Not smoothly, not without resistance still in pockets of the town. She was not naive about that. There would be more sideways looks. More conversations that shifted when she walked in. More Gerald Pratts in various configurations that she hadn't met yet. She knew that. She had always known that. But the town had seen her, and she had not left. And something about that, the simple, stubborn fact of remaining, had changed the terms. She walked through the morning with her work bag on one shoulder and her notebook in her pocket, and the spring light on the street. And she thought about what Florence had said weeks ago at the kitchen table. The only answer to a vague lie is visible evidence. But that takes time. 3 months, she thought. 3 months of visible evidence, one piece at a time. She went home. She had a dress to finish. The dress was finished by Friday. It was Mrs. Halverson's daughter's dress for the spring social. Pale green cotton with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved correctly when she walked, which was the thing the girl had asked for specifically, with the instinctive understanding that 16-year-olds sometimes have about what they actually need from clothing. Clara had spent 2 extra hours on the hem because the fabric had a slight diagonal pull that would have shown within a month if she'd rushed it, and she did not rush hems. When the girl came for the fitting and put it on and turned in front of Florence's mirror, she went very still for a moment in the way people go still when something fits them, the way things rarely fit. Not just the body, but some idea of themselves they'd been carrying around without quite being able to articulate. "Oh," she said. "The hem will hold," Clara said. "Don't let anyone tell you it needs taking up. It doesn't." The girl looked at herself for another moment. Then she looked at Clara in the mirror. "You really can see it, can't you? What's something supposed to be?" Clara considered this. "I see the grain of the fabric," she said. "I work with that instead of against it. Most problems come from working against what something actually is." She had said it as a practical observation about sewing. She did not realize until later, walking back from delivering the dress, that she had also said something true about the last 4 months of her life, and possibly about everything before them too. The move to the ranch happened in stages, which was the practical reality of 2 people combining lives that had been entirely separate and had developed, over years of independence, their own particular shapes. Cole's ranch house was larger than she'd expected. 4 rooms, solidly built, with a stone fireplace in the main room that drew well and a kitchen that needed work but had good bones. He had kept it with the functional minimalism of a man living alone, which meant it was clean and sparsely furnished and had very little that wasn't necessary. The walls were bare, there were no curtains. There were excellent tools organized along the workshop wall with the careful logic of someone who thought spatially and didn't lose things. Clara looked at it all and thought, this is a house that knows how to work. It doesn't know yet how to be lived in. She did not try to transform it quickly, which would have been wrong for both of them. She brought her things in pieces. The work table first, because that was the foundation of everything. Then the fabric boxes. Then the personal items she'd accumulated in 3 months at Florence's that she hadn't even realized she'd accumulated until she was packing them. They learned each other's habits the way people learn such things. By collision, occasional adjustment, and the gradual building of a shared grammar. He was up before 4 every morning, gone to the barn before she was conscious, back by 6 with the quality of a man who had already done 3 hours of substantive work and was now willing to be in a house. She worked later than he did, often past the point when he'd come to stand in the workshop doorway with the expression of a man who found it mildly unreasonable that another person didn't register the hour the way he did. She wrote in the notebook, "I work when the work is there." He wrote back, "The work is always there. That's not the same as you having to be with it at 10 o'clock at night." She wrote, "Says the man who was in the barn at 4 this morning." He wrote, "That's different." "How?" "The cattle don't wait, neither do hems." He looked at her for a moment, and then something in his face moved and he went back to his chair, which she had come to understand was his version of conceding a point he found amusing. These were not dramatic negotiations. They were the small, daily negotiations of people figuring out how to share space without losing themselves in it. And they were sometimes frustrating and sometimes funny, and almost always resolved, one way or another, before the next morning. Button adapted to this ranch with the complete shamelessness of an animal discovering that more space meant more things to investigate. Cole had, at some point in the first 2 weeks, begun leaving a specific spot near the fireplace clear of everything else, which was technically Button's sleeping place now, and had never been formally designated as such, and would never be discussed. Clara noticed. She said nothing. Some things were better confirmed by silence than by speech. It was Petra who first used the word that Clara had not thought to apply to what was happening. She came out to the ranch on a Saturday in early June, ostensibly to help with alterations on the Halverson contract. There was more ranch work than Clara could take on alone, and she had started bringing Petra in on the simpler pieces. But also, clearly, because she was Petra, and the ranch was new and interesting, and she had opinions about everything. They were working at the table in the afternoon light when Petra looked up and said, "Mrs. Lund told my mother that the miller's wife is asking about bringing you on for the fall wedding season, for her daughter and 2 other girls." "I know," Clara said. "She wrote to me last week." "And?" "I'm thinking about it. It's a significant amount of work on a compressed schedule." "You'd need help," Petra said. "I'd need someone who can do clean alterations and take direction," Clara said, looking at Petra with the specific kind of direct gaze that meant something was being offered without being stated explicitly. Petra understood it immediately. She was 16 and quick and had been training her attention on Clara for 4 months. "I can do clean alterations," she said carefully. "I know you can. I've seen your work. And I take direction reasonably well." "You take direction very well when you agree with it," Clara said. "That's not exactly the same thing, but it's close enough for most purposes." Petra laughed. Genuinely, the way young people laugh when they've been seen accurately and don't mind. Then she went back to the hem she was running and was quiet for a moment. "It's funny," she said after a while. "What is?" "When you arrived, people were talking about you like you were a problem that had appeared. And now," she considered, "now you're one of the reasons people in this county have decent clothes." Clara looked at her. "That's a smaller legacy than I might have hoped for." "I didn't mean it small," Petra said quickly. "I meant—" She stopped, looking for the word. "My father said something at dinner last week. He said that the meeting at the courthouse, the things you and Cole did, changed the way he thinks about what a person can and can't do, what you can decide just by looking at someone." She paused. "He's not a man who changes his thinking easily." He said it took him by surprise. Clara kept her needle moving, in, out, even tension. The light through the ranch window was warm and long, and the afternoon was quiet, except for the sound of the work and the distant sound of coal in the barn and the creek running somewhere beyond the north field. "Your father is a fair man," Clara said finally. "He is," Petra agreed. "He just needed something to be fair about." In late June, the school term ended and the schoolteacher, a young man named Ellery, who had been in Harlan Creek for 2 years and was, by most accounts, good at his work, but overwhelmed by the range of what he was expected to manage, came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and an expression of careful purpose. He had come, it turned out, because of a boy in his classroom named Silas Crane, who was 11 and had been deaf since infancy, and whose parents had recently moved to a farm 5 miles east of town. Silas had been in school for 3 weeks and had, by Ellery's account, learned essentially nothing. Not because he was incapable, Ellery was careful to say, but because Ellery had no idea how to teach someone who couldn't hear him. "I don't know what I'm doing," Ellery said, with the directness of a young man who had enough security in his competence to admit clearly when he was outside it. And Silas knows, "I don't know. I can see it in his face." Cole was at the table while this conversation happened. He read Ellery's face and enough of the exchange to follow it, and Clara caught him up in the notebook where she missed things. When Ellery finished, Cole took the notebook and wrote, "I'll come on Friday, and again the following week. We'll see what works." He handed it to Clara to read aloud. Ellery looked at Cole with the expression of a man recalibrating something, not just the immediate situation, but some broader assumption he'd been carrying. "You'd do that?" Cole wrote, "He's 11. Someone should have done it 2 years ago." There was nothing generous or sentimental in the way he wrote it, just the flat statement of what was true. Ellery read it and nodded and thanked them both and left with the slightly dazed quality of someone whose problem had just been solved in a way they hadn't anticipated. Clara looked at Cole across the table. He was already looking back at her. She wrote, "You didn't say anything to me about doing that." He wrote, "I just decided." "I know, I'm not objecting. I'm noting that you just decided." He wrote, "You're doing the same thing with Petra." She looked at that. She wrote, "That's different. How?" She thought about it honestly. Then she wrote, "It's not different." He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. Cole went to the school on Friday, then the following Friday. By the third visit, he had established a working system with Silas, a combination of written instruction, spatial demonstration, and the particular patience of a man who had spent 20 years developing ways to communicate across the gap that most people didn't bother to cross. Ellery watched and learned faster than Cole had expected, which Cole told Clara in the notebook with the flat satisfaction of someone who gives credit where it's accurate. By September, Silas Crane was ahead of 3 of his hearing classmates in arithmetic and reading, which Ellery reported with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from watching something work that you'd been told couldn't work. He told Clara, and Clara told Florence, and Florence told 2 people, and within a week it had moved through the town in the way the good word always moved, faster than the bad word, and further. Jonas Voss came to the ranch one afternoon and sat in Cole's kitchen and talked to them both, with Petra there to help move the conversation across when the notebook wasn't fast enough, about whether the county school board could be approached about formalizing some kind of arrangement. He was on the school committee. He had already spoken to Ellery. "The county doesn't have anything like this," Voss said, "a formal method for teaching children with hearing difficulties alongside the others. Ellery says what Cole's doing isn't complicated. It just requires someone who knows it." Cole wrote, "It requires someone who's willing to learn it. That's not the same as someone who knows it." Voss read that. He nodded slowly in the way of a man who had just been corrected and found the correction accurate. "Fair," he said. "Fair enough." He looked at them both. "Would you be willing to put something on paper, what you're doing, how it works, something the school board could look at?" Cole and Clara looked at each other. She wrote to him, "You write it. I'll correct the grammar." He wrote back, "My grammar is fine. Your grammar is functional. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Voss and nodded. The paper Cole wrote, with Clara's edits, was 4 pages. It described in plain language what he had done with Silas and why, and what Ellery had learned and what it would require to do the same for other children in similar situations. It was not a polished document. It had one sentence that Clara had rewritten 4 times because Cole kept reverting to his original version, which was accurate but abrupt in a way that would have put the school board's backs up. They had a genuine argument about the fourth sentence on page 2 that lasted 3 days and ended with a compromise that neither of them was fully satisfied with, which Clara told him was the sign of a correct compromise. She was right. The school board accepted the proposal in October and asked Cole to continue his involvement through the following school year, with a small formal arrangement attached to it. It was the first time Cole Mercer had held any kind of official position in Harlan Creek. He had lived in the county for 12 years, had paid his taxes and run his land and done his business, and he had never once been asked to formally contribute to the thing he was part of. Clara thought about this while she was watching him read the board's letter at the kitchen table, his face going through the same controlled expression it always did when he was processing something significant and not performing his reaction. She wrote, "How does it feel?" He held the pencil for a long time. Then he wrote, "Strange, like being let into a room you've been outside of for a long time and finding it's a room you could have been in all along." She read that. She wrote, "Yes, that's exactly what it feels like." They sat at the table in the kitchen of the ranch house that had learned, over the months since spring, how to be lived in. The curtain she'd made for the south window, the tool organization that was still his but had shifted slightly to accommodate her work, the basket near the fire where Button had graduated from a spot to an established territory, and the afternoon light came through the glass and sat on the table between them. Walter Goss left Harlan Creek in November. The official reason given was that he was relocating to be closer to family in the East, which may have been partly true. The actual reason, as Florence parsed it at the kitchen table with the precision of a woman who had watched 18 years of local politics, was that his position had become untenable. Without Pratt's backing and with the school board arrangement publicly associated with Cole and the seamstress work publicly associated with Clara, the narrative he'd tried to construct had simply run out of oxygen. He needed them to be what he said they were, Florence said, and they kept being something else. Eventually, the story collapses. Gerald Pratt remained. He ran his store, and he sat on the commercial committee, and he moved through Harlan Creek with the slightly reduced profile of a man who had been publicly named as the source of a bad thing and had not successfully argued otherwise. He was not destroyed. Clara had not been trying to destroy him, had never been trying to destroy him, and the distinction mattered to her. He was simply a man who had been wrong and had said so, and was now living in the town that had witnessed both events, which was its own kind of consequence. He came into Mrs. Lund's workroom one morning in December, while Clara was there for the weekly order review, needing a coat relining. Mrs. Lund was in the back. It was just the two of them in the front room. He set the coat on the counter without meeting her eyes. Then he looked up. "I hear the school arrangement is going well," he said. "It is," Clara said. "And the business?" "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the coat. "I imagine you could charge more than you're charging." "Probably," she said. "But the point isn't to charge the most the market will bear. The point is to do work worth paying for and have enough people paying for it to keep doing it." Pratt looked at her. Something moved in his face. Recognition, she thought, or the near neighbor of it. "That's a more sensible business philosophy than most people in this town operate on," he said. "I learned it from necessity," she said. "Most good things are," he said. He picked up his coat receipt and left. She stood in Mrs. Lund's workroom for a moment after the bell over the door finished ringing. She thought that was the closest thing to a conversation they had ever actually had. 3 months of collision, a courthouse meeting, a train platform, and the closest thing to a real conversation was 2 minutes about coat linings and business philosophy in December. There was something in that, something about how long it took people to actually talk to each other, and how many complicated things had to happen first, and how the conversations that mattered often arrived late and in plain clothes and didn't announce themselves. She went back to work. By the following spring, a full year since Clara had stepped off that train with her trunk in the mud and $14.60, the ranch was running at a scale that required 2 additional hired hands through the busy season, and the seamstress work had expanded to the point that Petra was coming 4 days a week, and they were turning away orders they couldn't fit. Not because the work wasn't there, but because there were only so many hours, and Clara had learned, through some difficulty, that more work than you could do well was worse than less work done properly. Harlan Creek was not transformed. She had never believed it would be. It was still a rough, practical, imperfect frontier town with mud on the main street and opinions in the barber shop and the ordinary human tendency to judge things quickly and revise slowly. The sideways looks had mostly stopped, but mostly was doing real work in that sentence, and she knew it. There were still people in the county who had fixed ideas about what a woman with a damaged voice was capable of, and about a deaf rancher holding an official school position. And those people did not change because of a courthouse meeting or a 4-page school proposal. But there were also Petra, who was becoming a genuinely skilled seamstress and who would, Clara thought, do something with it that neither of them could currently predict. There was Silas Crane, who was 12 now and had caught up fully with his grade level and who had started, of his own initiative, teaching the hand signs he and Cole had developed to 2 younger children in the school whose hearing was partial. There was Ellery, who had written to the Territorial Education Office about the teaching method and had received a letter back expressing interest. There was Dr. Dean, who cited the Mercer case regularly when arguing against the kind of administrative overreach that Goss had attempted, and who had been asked twice to speak at county meetings on the subject. Things spread in ways that couldn't be tracked. That was something Clara had come to understand that year, that the effects of a thing were rarely visible in the moment of the thing, and that the people who expected immediate transformation were usually the ones who gave up. The real work was slow and looked, from the outside, like nothing much. It looked like a seamstress doing alterations and a rancher going to a school on Fridays. It looked like a woman with a rough voice speaking at a public meeting to 40 people, half of whom couldn't quite hear her. But Petra's father had changed how he thought about what a person could and couldn't do just by looking at them. And Jonas Voss was on the school board bringing a formal proposal, and Silas Crane was teaching other children. Things spread. You couldn't always see where they went. But one evening in late April, almost exactly a year after the day she had first seen Cole Mercer on the creek road with a bay horse and a pair of wire cutters on his belt, they were sitting on the south porch of the ranch house in the last of the daylight. The pasture was green with the new season, and the cattle were out in it doing what cattle did, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and Button was asleep across both their feet in the determined way that had become non-negotiable. Clara had the notebook in her lap, but wasn't writing. Cole was looking at the pasture. After a while she wrote, "What are you thinking about?" He took the notebook. He thought for a moment, then he wrote, "The north fence line needs work before summer, and Farron wants to increase the contract." She looked at him. "And?" she wrote. He understood what the "and" was asking. He held the pencil. He wrote, "And I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, and everything I can see from here is mine, ours. Built from things that were true." She read that. She looked at the pasture. She looked at the green of it, the long light across it, the ordinary and specific beauty of a piece of land that was being taken care of by people who understood it. She thought about a woman on a train platform with a trunk in the mud. She thought about all the ways that woman could have made a different decision, could have taken the Thursday train east, could have folded herself back into the life she'd come from, smaller and safer and further from anything that might reject her again. She thought about how reasonable that would have been, how understandable. How many people would have said, of course she left. What was there to stay for? And she thought about the particular thing, not courage exactly, not strength in the dramatic sense, but the stubbornness of a woman who had been told her whole life that her voice was the problem, and who had decided at some point without ceremony that the voice was hers and the problem was the telling. She wrote, "I almost left the first day. I sat on the platform for a long time." He read it. He wrote, "I know. You couldn't know that. No," he wrote. "But I know you, so I know." She looked at that for a moment. Then she wrote, "What would you have done if I'd left?" He thought about it with the honesty he always brought to questions he could have deflected. He wrote, "Gone on the same way I was going, done the work, come to town on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and been alone." "Yes," he wrote, "and been alone." A pause, then, "That was already my life. It was a life. It worked." "But," she wrote. He looked at the pasture. He wrote, "But this is better. Not because it's easier, because it's truer. More of what's actually possible is being used." She sat with that for a long time. More of what's actually possible is being used. She thought that was the best thing she'd read all year, and she had read a considerable amount. She thought it was something she would carry for a long time in the place where she kept the things that were most true, alongside not because it's easy, but because it's truer, alongside Florence saying the only answer to a vague lie is visible evidence, alongside everything she had learned about seams and grain and working with what something actually was instead of what you wanted it to be. She did not write any of that back to him. Some things didn't require a response. Some things were complete as they were. She put the notebook in her pocket and leaned back in her chair and looked at the pasture alongside him, with Button across their feet and the creek sound in the distance and the light going down in long copper lines behind the ridge. The frontier evening came in quiet and cold and complete, the way it always had, indifferent to everything that had happened in it. They sat in it together. The fence needed work before summer. The contract with Farron was increasing. Petra was coming Monday. There was a coat waiting in the workshop with a difficult collar that she'd been thinking about for 3 days, turning the problem in her mind the way she turned all problems, patiently, looking for the grain, waiting for the approach that worked with the material instead of against it. There was always work. There was always the next piece in the pile. But here, on this porch, with this man, in this life that had been built from refusal and stubbornness and the plain daily work of people who had decided to stay, here, for the first time in 31 years, Clara Whitmore did not need the work to justify the moment. The moment was enough on its own. She had not known it could be before now. Now she did.